What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if AZULA found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender, Part 11. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed AZULA. There were moments of doubt as Suki followed AZULA back to the colonies. The other Kyoshi warriors had agreed to tag along with the crown princess to Zilong for a quicker ship ride back home. And Suki had agreed to join in the trip to see them off before returning to Ba Sing Se, considering that she planned on staying for a while. Spending a few more days before saying goodbyes to her friends was the least she could do. It also allowed Suki to further develop the surprising budding friendship with AZULA and Tai Li. The two Fire Nation girls had been approachable in their own ways, with the princess being more snarky about it while the lightly dressed acrobat exuded excitement at befriending someone who could almost keep up with her movements. Despite being all smiles, Suki knew better than to assume that Tai Li had nothing more than her cheery disposition. She'd seen the girl rush into combat during Jet's idiotic attempt to attack Xing. The combination of precision, agility, and speed Tai Li displayed would have made her a nightmare to face if she actually bothered to pick up a weapon. Even with her bare hands, she supposedly brought down a group of men without breaking a sweat. Quite unexpectedly, Tai Li eagerly shared her insight into pressure points with the Kyoshi warriors, though it'd take plenty of lessons with her to incorporate the information into their fighting stances. Besides that, Tai Li proved preternaturally emphatic, consoling Suki and the others at highly convenient moments. Suki watched her break Lucci and mew down into cathartic weeping with nothing but calming shushes and a reassuring embrace out of the blue. Similar gestures made the others expunge the horrible burdens that they carried, and the other Kyoshi warriors were walking straighter and smiling more after their encounter with her. Not Suki, though. For some reason, Tai Li did not approach her with such comfort. "It's not for me to offer," she said with a cheeky grin. "You probably want someone else to pamper you. Someone princely and trustworthy and warm." It took some effort to quell the embers of emotion as a particular person flashed in Suki's mind, but she managed to ignore the girl's teasing somewhat. Thankfully, AZULA barely cared about that little exchange, the princess' only reaction being a quiet snort before she turned away. For all of the princess' attempts to keep aloof, however, it was clear that AZULA was a far cheerier person than before. She wasn't exactly all smiles like Tai Li, but every now and then AZULA would break into a grin or smirk that Suki could best describe as wistful and predatory. Apparently she and Xing had gotten very close, and Suki most definitely did not feel envious of the princess. Nor did she feel defeated. To do so would have to admit that she was trying to compete with AZULA, and Suki bitterly admitted that she knew how far away she stood. Besides, AZULA had done a lot for her already. It'd be disgraceful and ungrateful to seek out Xing's attention. Other than that niggling emotion at the back of her head, though, Suki found herself becoming good friends with AZULA and Tai Li by the time they reached Zilong, which made it all the more interesting when the party was stopped at the colony town's gates by a group of Fire Nation soldiers. These men wore shinier and more ornately decorated armor. Suki could make out the stylized flames and dragons etched into the metal plates. Despite that, she found herself far from impressed by the soldiers wearing them. They stood too straight, too confidently, compared to even AZULA's bodyguards. Cocksure, complacent, pathetic. The Kyoshi warriors found themselves quickly becoming wary of the men, especially with how the leader of the welcoming party eyed them with unabashed disgust. "Captain, what are the Fire Lord's palace guards doing here?" AZULA asked with hands on her hips and her head tilted to one side. The soldiers all bowed as one, though if Suki remembered her Fire Nation etiquette correctly, their bows were shallower than a princess deserved. "Your Highness, it brings us joy to know that you have returned safely." "That does not answer my question, Captain." The leader saluted sharply. "The Fire Lord has tasked us with awaiting your arrival, Your Highness." We are here to deliver his royal decree." Suki watched as AZULA, Tai Li, and the guards escorting them all go down on one knee, with varying degrees of obedience and annoyance, as the man produced a scroll of red, black, and gold. He looked ready to unroll it, but then gave a pointed look at the Kyoshi warriors. AZULA raised her head to draw the man's gaze. "The Kyoshi warriors are my guests, but they are not subjects of the Fire Nation. They are not beholden to our ways." "Humph. As you say, Your Highness." With a final unhappy look at Suki and her sisters, the captain unrolled the scroll and began to read. "It is Fire Lord Ozai's great pleasure to declare that through his stalwart service, Prince Zuko's exile has been lifted, and he is welcomed back to the Fire Lord's presence as a loyal son. Though Prince Zuko has been reinstated to the royal household, Fire Lord Ozai will retain Crown Princess AZULA as his heir for the time being, due to her diligent work in service of the Fire Nation." There was a pause, which apparently signaled for the audience to react. A frown flashed across Tai Li's face, and even AZULA's bodyguards wore some signs of concern. The princess, though, only gave a nod, and her voice suggested that she was smiling thinly. "I'm glad that my brother's exile has been lifted. I take it he is back home now." The captain nodded curtly. With his rank as prince returned, Prince Zuko is released by royal order from the 11th Royal Regiment, and has returned to the royal palace to continue his lessons in statecraft to make up for his long absence. "Good for Zuko," the princess remarked dryly. The captain ignored the words and went back to reading the scroll aloud. Furthermore, in addition to the reinstatement of Prince Zuko, Fire Lord Ozai also declares a celebration in honor of Crown Princess AZULA for her exceptional work in uplifting the Fire Nation colonies in such a short time, despite her youth. This time, AZULA visibly tensed. As such, the Fire Lord is overjoyed to welcome Crown Princess AZULA back to the royal capital, where she may then freely continue refining her talent for administration with the best minds of the Fire Nation, so that her growth would not be stunted. In the interim, a colonial regent will be appointed to oversee the colonial ministry, so that all of the Crown Princess work does not stagnate nor falter. That sounded too much like AZULA was being replaced. Judging from how the princess had gone stiff, it probably was even worse than that. "I thank my royal father for his generous consideration," she managed to say, probably through gritted teeth. "I will return to the capital as soon as I am done with my duties as a royal host." The captain gave the Kyoshi warriors another look before he nodded with distaste. "As you will, Your Highness." The soldiers gave a bow before turning their backs and leaving. AZULA and her entourage rose up, and then Suki took a surprised step back as the princess' eyes turned to her, full of barely contained rage. In contrast, Tai Li beside her was nothing but worried. "Honored guests," AZULA addressed the Kyoshi warriors with a shallow bow. "I'm afraid I must cut short the intended send-off for you." "It's all right, AZULA," Suki awkwardly replied. "You have things to deal with after all." The princess shook her head as she snapped her fingers. "Nevertheless, it is a poor showing on my end that I am unable to give you all an appropriate farewell for your aid in my colonies. Come, I will lead you to your inn, and then introduce you to the captain of the ship that will take you back home. It's the least I can do." In no position to argue at all, the Kyoshi warriors followed AZULA into Zilong, and immediately Suki noted the change in atmosphere compared to the last time she was here. There was bustling, but it carried an undercurrent of nervousness rather than a lively, prosperous vigor. The merchants' yelling sounded more desperate than welcoming to her ears, and many of the adult Earth Kingdom migrants were glancing about furtively. Even the colony's guards looked uncomfortable as they patrolled the streets. The colonists' gaze were all drawn to AZULA as she walked down the main road, and Suki felt something akin to solidified hope radiating all around her. AZULA noticed it as well, as she stopped to regard her spectators. "What's going on here?" An official meekly shuffled out. The way he stumbled his first few steps seemed to Suki like he was volunteered. Your Highness. It is most wonderful to see you again." "I do not have time to waste," the princess warned sternly. "Why is everyone so worried?" Yes. Well, Governor Han has been, replaced for..." The official paused to gulp as AZULA's glare bore into him. For failing to enforce Fire Nation laws, Suki felt the growing intensity of her royal friend's wrath abate out of surprise. "What laws?" They were former Governor Han was found negligent in maintaining Fire Nation interests in Zilong. A haughty voice interrupted. and Suki saw the crowd part in one area for a smug prick in a high official's robes walk out. The bow he gave AZULA looked deep enough, but it still reeked of an arrogance that called out to Suki for a beat down. Crown Princess AZULA, I am Governor Seo, most grateful to be just appointed by the royal capital. I promise to ensure that your hard work in Zilong continues to grow most prosperously. What laws did Han miss? AZULA demanded, ignoring the flowery greeting completely. The new governor in turn ignored her fury, rising up and adjusting his sleeves too casually. The former governor was found in dereliction of protecting Fire Nation culture in this backwater, as well as allowing for the local people to mingle too freely with our Fire Nation colonists. Not to mention the taxation oversight. I had those stupid discriminatory laws thrown out of the colonies. The crown princess hissed with a fury that startled the townsfolk. How do you think I got the Earth Kingdom merchants to actually trade here? Or their farmers to settle down here? Governor Seo, whether bravely or idiotically, just sniffed at the face of royal wrath. That is indeed true, Your Highness. However, as a royal colony under your favor, expert lawmakers in the capital have discovered that Zilong is above the colonial ministry, and as such it is only beholden to laws set by the palace itself, as fitting of a settlement worthy of a crown princess attention. And the royal palace does not share the same amendments to the colonies as the colonial ministry. Tai Li had to place a hand on AZULA as the latter took a dangerous step towards the preening governor. And no one thought to inform me of all of that? It would be most rude to burden your highness with such a trivial matter. Besides, the former Governor Han was quite unsuitable and undeserving of the title. Seo sniffed again. I understand your highness' generosity, and the lad might have some modicum of talent for his age. But truly, it is improper for one born and raised in the Bunas to govern their own. One can't trust the natives to rule their fellows on behalf of the Fire Lord. Suki felt someone's other hand on her shoulder, and only then realized that she too had taken a step forward. Okuni had held her back, just as Sanyong and Miyu were restraining Kana. AZULA's wrath could be literally felt, as heat radiated from her and washed across Suki's skin. She shook off Tai Li's hand and stalked over to Seo, with wisps of smoke trailing her footsteps. Tell me, governor, who appointed you? And Seo preened even more. Why? The Fire Lord himself bestowed me this great honor, for the meager but hard work my family has contributed to the Fire Nation. The arrogant look he dared give the princess, the look that knew he was untouchable, riled even Tai Li up, who had to be kept back by a bodyguard. Several tense seconds of silence passed before AZULA replied. I see. She drew herself up and cast a steely gaze to the crowd around her, before fixing her glare back at the new governor. I'll have to seek my father for further clarification then, she declared aloud, enough for everyone to hear. I will see you again later, Governor Seo, to discuss the tending of this colony. The man had the audacity to grin as he bowed. I eagerly look forward to your return, Your Highness. It was with understandable haste that they skipped the inn altogether, and AZULA led the party to the docks. AZULA made a short detour to the messenger hawk roost to deliver a couple of messages, and singled out an unfortunate official to angrily whisper an order at him. Despite the sour mood everyone was left in, Suki said her fondest goodbyes to her sister warriors. I'll leave the novices to you, Okuni. We're the last of Kyoshi's untarnished legacy. Make sure they live up to it. The other warrior smirked as she patted Suki on the shoulder. I'll look after our new sisters and the island. Make sure you don't come back with too many of the scorpion's brood. Laughing at that parting joke, the Kyoshi warriors left Suki sputtering and boarded the ship for home. To make matters worse, Tai Li was grinning as she whispered a bit too loudly. Hey AZULA, I think Suki has a thing for your fiancé. Zuko sighed as he stood by the docks and watched as his sister disembarked. AZULA was clearly angry as she stomped her way to dry land. The prince tried not to wince as he recalled the reason for her wrath. His father's sudden forgiveness had been suspicious and impossible to refuse, but recalling AZULA and practically removing her from her post had made Zuko even more wary of the Fire Lord. The palace courtiers did not help with their simpering and deluded petitions. Zuko didn't need any courtly lessons to see that their relief at his return were as hollow as their smiles, and they were merely jockeying for his favor. What was surprising, though, was the barely hidden disdain many of these courtiers had for AZULA. It took some hindsight, but Zuko found that the nobles who approached him were largely seeking to build a power base around him for some reason. Zuko tried his best to stay out of all the politicking, but he was inevitably made a figurehead of his very own faction, or a parody of a faction, when one peered through its thin mask with minimum effort. In truth, the nobles and commanders that sought to Leonize the prince were also ardent supporters of the Fire Lord. It was weird and disconcerting to see such support thrown his way out of nowhere, and for the life of him, Zuko could not figure out what his father and the royal court wanted from him. Hopefully, with AZULA now back, they could get this whole performance over with, and he'd find out. Hopefully, whatever the Fire Lord has planned would not harm AZULA's station too much. Zuko doubted that she'd be called back merely for the celebrations that their father had announced. And here's to hoping that Prince and Princess would not be literally pitted against each other, too. Zuko had no doubt of his inferior skill compared to AZULA, be it in the field of combat or politics. He did not look forward to another punch to the guts. His sister walked up to him with her meager entourage in tow, her keen eyes barely acknowledging Zuko as they scanned her surroundings. Finally, AZULA stopped before Zuko, sizing him up with a frown for a second. "Where are my staff?" she asked in a low, impatient tone. Fortunately, the woman behind Zuko saved him the trouble and spoke up, her voice a pretty chime that was likely honed in etiquette lessons. "Your Highness, I am Lianyu. Your father, the magnanimous Fire Lord, has appointed me as your new head handmaiden." She then gestured with a sweep of her robed arms. "I have the honor to lead your new servants to see to your needs." Zuko almost sighed aloud as his sister's imperious attention was drawn away from him and to the gaggle of women behind him. "Is that so? What happened to my old staff?" Lianyu bravely answered without flinching. "The Fire Lord has, in his wisdom, sought to reform the palatial staff to ensure that the royal family enjoys the effective service it deserves. Unfortunately, Your Highness, there were concerns about the old batch of servants who were assigned to you, especially those who were drawn from the colonies." That last line was probably the flimsiest piece technicality Zuko had ever encountered. It was no secret that AZULA had taken in daughters and widows from outcast noble-born families to serve her in the capital city. It was only because their families relocated to the colonies, under her sponsorship too, that they were all suddenly branded as colonists when the Fire Lord decided on the surprise reforms, with all the negative connotations that came with it. "They've been fired then," AZULA said bluntly. "Have they been given their due compensation at least? Your Highness need not concern herself with matters beneath your station. The Fire Lord has tasked competent overseers to ensure that palace operations run smoothly, without any incident. Your old staff are still in the palace, AZULA." Zuko decided to cut in, sending his sister's gaze snapping towards him. "They're still being, debriefed along with the others." That seemed to ease her up a little. "How long will the process take?" Lianyu seized back the reins of the conversation. "It is a lengthy process, my princess dash." She froze and Zuko took a startled step back when AZULA literally growled all of the sudden. Was it the term of address, or the fact that the woman had cut in? "Never mind," AZULA said curtly through gritted teeth. "I'll seek them later. There are tasks that they have been assigned to, tasks whose progress I require to be updated on." The new head servant somehow managed to smoothly reinsert herself back to the conversation without the need to cough or clear her throat. "I can see the issue done with, Your Highness. If it's urgent dash, I'll deal with it myself," the princess harshly interrupted. "You should not concern yourself with matters above your station." It was quite impressive how she threw back the words Lianyu used on her. It even froze the new handmaiden for several seconds before the woman silently nodded and backed away. AZULA instantly ignored her and fixed her attention back to Zuko again. Thankfully, her anger was restrained and dimmed as their gazes met. She might be annoyed at him, but he wasn't the target of her wrath. "I see that congratulations are in order, Zuzu," AZULA dryly commented. "Welcome back to the home islands." Thanks, AZULA." His sister's eyes narrowed. "Where's Mai?" Zuko couldn't hide his discomfort. "She's with her family." Behind AZULA, Tai Li, who had been wearing an uncharacteristic frown ever since she made landfall, immediately looked very worried. It took AZULA a second to pick up on his innuendo, and her frown joined her friend's. "I see. I suppose I'll have to make time later to catch up with her." "It might be difficult," Zuko hinted. "She is undergoing education. To be introduced as an upper court debutante." As expected, AZULA was not at all amused by that bit of news. So, Okano finally got impatient. "Let me guess. She's going to present herself to you, dum-dum." Despite the dark undertone of the conversation, Zuko still felt his cheeks flush. Her, eligibility will be decided during her official introduction. The dangerous look his sister gave him was proof enough that she understood Mai's predicament. She'd been used both as reward and hostage for Zuko to accept his father's offer to come back. On paper, Okano was being rewarded for softening the Fire Lord's heart in ending his son's exile, by granting his daughter the opportunity to marry well above their minor noble station. The emphasis was on the word opportunity, because a royal engagement was not guaranteed. In reality, Mai was used to keep Zuko, and probably AZULA, behaving. Whether by Okano's scheming or their father's, the girl was now forced down a path with very limited options. She'd end up engaged to Zuko, or she'd be married off to some other noble, likely as a mere concubine. And Mai would have no say in the matter, nor alternatives like running away, because she and her whole family were now being hosted in one of the royal palace's guest houses, with all the heavy security that it provides. And for all that, it irritated Zuko to no end that he was not allowed to see her at all until she was ready. No doubt AZULA would suffer the same thing. "Clearly I have a lot of catching up to do," AZULA presently said. She began walking past her bowing handmaidens, ignoring them completely as they fell in behind her. "Zuzu, fill me in." Reluctantly, Zuko walked beside his sister, and did his best to sneak in what information he could through his limited expertise in courtly doublespeak. As they finally reached the palace and parted ways, AZULA didn't know whether to feel sorry for or annoyed at her brother. It was clear that their father was using him as a pawn to keep AZULA in line, though why it had to take place all of a sudden still mystified her. She knew that he might feel threatened by Xing's string of successes, but surely tying him to the family through marriage should have assuaged most of his worries? By their engagement, Xing's fortunes were now tied to AZULA, the heir to the throne. Surely her father, for all his paranoia, for all his worry that Xing might be influencing AZULA, however idiotic that notion sounded, surely he could at least understand the lack of threat the union represented? Or was this whole gesture to wield Zuko as a threat against AZULA a more direct message, one solely intended for her? If that was the case, why? Why threaten AZULA with demotion in both her ministerial post and position as his heir? Had the Fire Lord truly gone mad then? Or did he succumb to the whispers of envious courtiers seeking a slice of the colony's prosperity? There would be only one way to find out, but with court only being held tomorrow, AZULA had other things to deal with first, like her uprooted operatives, and Mai allowing herself to be turned into a hostage. Really, that girl keeps pretending that she's apathetic about the world around her, but she's clearly staying with her family to ensure their safety. AZULA would have to remember to correct her friend's impassive mask if the girl actually wanted to get close to Zuko. The self-deceit the princess could tolerate, but no way would she put up with the constant fake apathy from a sister-in-law. Dealing with Mai's insincere denial would be tantamount to bringing work home for AZULA. With the gaggle of Minders thinly disguised as handmaidens trailing after her, AZULA headed straight for her little corner of the palace. Immediately she noticed the unsubtle changes imposed around her. The guards she had handpicked from disgraced families were gone, replaced by her father's palatial guard. Servants shuffled about, their inexperience showing through how they seemed a little lost as they tried to discreetly move out of her way. The particular arrangements and facing of vases and ornaments were disturbed, telling AZULA that the whole palace wing had gone through an untidy inspection. Really, what did AZULA do to cause her father to suddenly treat her like a spy? The only bright spot was a small group of noble-born servants greeting her just outside her room. Lady Suwei led the other familiar faces in bowing before the princess. It seemed that they were spared from the mass layoffs, probably because these were all officially members of the colonial ministry instead of her household servants. If that was the case, all might not be lost then. AZULA would have to see which other groups survived the culling. "Welcome back, Your Highness. I wish the occasion was not marred by such unruly changes. You dishonor Her Highness with such a disrespectful greeting," the primped-up iguana parrot behind AZULA dared to scold. "Deepen your bows. This is the Crow Dash," AZULA turned on the woman with a glare. "Lady Suwei and her staff of liaisons have, by their loyalty and excellence in service to me, earned special dispensation in their dealings with me." She focused her glare and fought back a grin of satisfaction as Lian Yu and the other handmaidens shrank back. I tolerate some laxity and unnecessary etiquette from those who prove their worth to me, unlike newer, untrustworthy servants. I understand, Your Highness. Forgive my impetuousness. AZULA didn't bother replying, turning back to Sue instead and jerking her head to one side as a gesture to carry the meeting in the privacy of her room. The princess only cared about the breach of palace etiquette in the fact that it elicited ill-hidden shock from the supposed handmaidens. Recalling Ren's more blunt thoughts, damn what these overly powdered and air-filled nobles thought. A bedroom was just a room with a bed in it, and AZULA was still the crown princess, damn it. As the loyal staff filed into her room, AZULA turned to the flock of scandalized peacock pigeons. You lot, either wait for me to finish my meeting, or go be useful somewhere else. Tai Li with me. Unfortunately, Lian Yu had to speak again. Be but my princess dash, don't you ever use that address on me. AZULA snapped, her temper spiking. Do not presume to be so close to me that you can use such a term. That got them cowering. Good. She was nobody's princess. Nobody but Xing's. Calm down, AZULA, Tai Li suddenly said with surprising concern. You're letting the Yvets get to you. Well, she did have a point. No point in providing further fuel to her father with reports of her breaking into tantrums. AZULA gave a slow exhale before nodding. You're right, Tai Li. She returned her attention to Lian Yu. Either wait out here, or go do whatever it is you're supposed to do. I have an important meeting to take. But Your Highness, spirits, that woman was persistent. As your handmaidens, we should be at hand to meet any needs you might have. AZULA took slow breaths before forming a reply, but once more Tai Li was the one to intercede. This time by calling out sweetly for the nearby guards who were doing their best to not look uncomfortable. Hey there. Yeah, you four. Mind coming here for a moment? The men awkwardly marched over as the confused handmaidens watched on. Thanks. You guys look like properly trained guards, right? Tai Li waited for their uncertain nods before continuing. So, what do you guys do if there's a bunch of stubborn nobles not accepting an order of dismissal from a member of the royal family? One of the guards spoke up after a cough. We escort them off the premises, ma'am. I see. Tai Li gave the handmaidens a dirty smirk, and then glanced back at the guards. Well, the way I see and hear it, it seems that these nobles here, and servants too at that, are refusing to obey the crown princess order to stay out of her business. But we're her handmaidens. Lian Yu protested. And the Fire Lord's own servants stay out of his way unless he calls for them. Su Wei spitefully chirped in. So, what do you say, Mr. Palace Guard? The guards shared uneasy glances among themselves, and some eventually shrugged before they turned as one to AZULA. Would you like us to stop your serve these women from interfering with royal business, Your Highness? AZULA graciously granted them a grateful smile. Please do, Sergeant. Thank you. Fortunately, Lian Yu knew better than to continue squawking, so AZULA was allowed to enter her room in peace, within the limited privacy of her own room. It'd be delusional to think that the palace did not have its secret back doors and hidden alcoves. The princess let out a long sigh to vent her annoyance before turning her attention to Su Wei. Report. The old woman gave a wry smirk as she summarized succinctly. Well, you've been horribly castrated, Your Highness. AZULA just rolled her eyes. I can see that. Just tell me, how bad is it? Am I getting effed with a splintered pole or a barbed lance? Tai Li feigned a shocked gasp, while the other servants were more genuine with it. Su Wei, though, cackled at the choice of words. Yes. Then the humor fled the woman's eyes and her gaze became heavy. The throne has ordered for the reinforcement of old laws, Fire Lord Sozin's laws, to ensure that proper Fire Nation culture be untainted. Anyone from the colonies will have to require thorough testing, whatever that means, before they can apply for a job anywhere in the capital, let alone within the palace. And because all it took was for a close family member to migrate over for the term colonist to stick, AZULA was in danger of losing a huge chunk of her talented staff. And the whole testing excuse was a convenient excuse to hold her old staff, AZULA thought bitterly. But she shouldn't be the only one with that problem. I'm guessing there are workarounds? She asked, and Su Wei nodded grimly. The Fire Lord, and only the Fire Lord, may be persuaded to waive the process for particular personnel who he thinks are talented and untainted enough from lowly Earth Kingdom practices. He has thus far not entertained any such petitions, though many courtiers have fortuitously already changed their staff before the decree was made official. Su Wei gave a pause and stared at AZULA for a silent second. It should be noted, Princess, that the decree was both brought up and then put into immediate effect within an afternoon. Shit. The princess let out another heavy sigh. I have the whole day. Might as well get it over with. Elaborate to me just how much I'm at risk of losing. And Sue did so, leaving no detail out. And AZULA began to seriously wonder whether it's the whole palace that had gone mad and dragged her father with it, or if it was the other way around. Mai would have to figure out a way to unhostage herself. AZULA would be too busy trying to salvage whatever she could from this debacle. There was no mistaking the tense air as court was held in the royal palace. The easy confidence many of the traditionalists had felt when they voiced their suggestions and support of the Fire Lord's restructuring was now gone after news spread of Crown Princess AZULA's unabated defiance the day before. High General Bujing almost scoffed at the shattered delusions of the schemers. They glossed over the dangers of drawing her ire, simply assuming that the princess shared their cowardice and selfishness to dare remain defiant. Instead, it was made very clear yesterday of the young heir's wrath. Her newly assigned handmaidens were thrown out of the palace wing and removed from their prestigious posts in all but name. The palace guards that were supposed to serve as a reminder of the Fire Lord's authority were cowed into subservience, and it was truly pitiful what the first batch of firebending masters had endured. Princess AZULA had sparred against them, all 6 of them at the same time. And if not for what the guards reported was intervention from her childhood friend Tai Li, the palace would be busy processing 6 corpses right about now. The princess was angry, and to make matters worse, none of it was directed at her brother, as some had planned for. No, from what Bujing heard, Prince Zuko treaded carefully around his sister, but otherwise their interactions were cordial. The foolish plan of instigating sibling rivalry had utterly failed. As it should, Bujing thought to himself with some satisfaction. Allowing the Fire Lord to pay heed to the appeals of certain simpering nobles had been a mistake. They had played on his understandable concern about the boy Xing possibly aiming to exploit the princess, and in doing so inflamed a concern into an almost real threat, to the point that the question of Xing's loyalty became far from hypothetical. General Shainu and a few others had spoken out against the madness when the suggestion of reassessing the princess' power to temporarily sever Xing's dependency on her. For that, Shainu was reassigned to the front, while the nobles that voiced the same thoughts no longer had the privileges to attend court. To Bujing's eternal shame, he had not dared speak in support of his colleague. Unlike Shainu, who recently rose from hard service, Bujing had to admit that he had grown to be as much a politician as a military strategist. Unlike Shainu, Bujing had far more to lose if his position in the Fire Lord's inner circle was in the slightest bit of danger. So the High General had to simply watch as events unfold and offer what carefully worded advice he could as a poor counterbalance to the mania that was sweeping the royal court. Princess AZULA's own supporters had kept their silence, wisely at first to preserve their presence in court, but only a paltry few courtiers were left after the Fire Lord sprang the surprise decree that discounted any colonist's eligibility in the capital city. With that, and the return of Prince Zuko, the palace moved on with its plans to return Princess AZULA back to a more appropriate and proper upbringing. Of course, that many courtiers would soon have their relatives assigned to prominent positions in the colonies, to leech off the established streams of wealth and influence, was a convenient bonus. It was tantamount to sending a hard-fighting soldier immediately back to the healers just to claim credit for the glorious kill he'd made. It was a disgraceful act, but one that was unfortunately common in court politics, and more importantly, it had the Fire Lord's support. Bujing hoped that the new colonial administrators would have enough sense to leave alone the complex machine the Crown Princess had left behind, and simply be content in plucking whatever bounties that the colonies generated. Otherwise, if they decided to try being smarter than they were, the colonies might very well regress back to a time before Princess AZULA took over. Speaking of, said princess was currently presenting herself before the Fire Lord, kneeling with barely repressed resentment. Father, the word was forced out and tainted with contempt. There wasn't even a glimmer of a sign that she interpreted the message the palace had concocted as how the traditionalists had expected her to. Watching from just a few paces from the curtain of fire obscuring the throne, Prince Zuko looked resigned. Most of the court wore confused or, if they had more sense like Bujing, worried expressions. Even the last of the princess supporters were concerned for her. The Fire Lord's reply was almost monotonous, carrying with it a slight edge of warning. "Azula, daughter, it heartens me to see you back so quickly. I've returned with all due haste, as a loyal daughter and servant to the Fire Nation should." Indeed. The silhouette of the Fire Lord rose up from the throne to stare down at the princess. "I understand that you must be feeling confused at the changes that has occurred in your absence. Be assured, Azula, that all of it has been done with only the good of the Fire Nation in mind. You are not being cast aside, nor your achievements ignored. I have simply been reminded that I might not have equipped you adequately for ruling, and I wish to amend that shortcoming." The girl's reaction barely changed. "As you say, father." Prince Zuko shuffled uncomfortably as his father then briefly directed his gaze at him. "In the same vein, I am aware that I have been unfair in my treatment of my son. As such, both my children will remain in the royal palace to complete their education. What was left unsaid was for how long, and more importantly, if the Fire Lord would change his choice of heir. The latter was no doubt a ploy to have the siblings see each other at least as rivals, to create a more favorable balance in palace politics, especially now that the princess had lost her power base. For the immediate future, she'd be forced to treat with traditionalists who would no doubt be jumping for joy at the chance to earn her favor." Prince Zuko responded by kneeling down in acknowledgement of the order, but otherwise said nothing. "If I may ask, father," the princess ventured with some caution, "have my results in the colonies not been proof enough that I am beyond mere palace tutors?" "In the realms of administration, perhaps," her father answered with a hint of arrogance. "However, it has come to my attention that you have been lacking in other fields, notably in royal etiquette and cultural studies. If you are to represent the Fire Nation in the colonies, you must carry yourself as a daughter of my blood should, to inspire and influence your lessers in that backwater towards more modern and civilized times." Royal disdain then colored his following admonishment. "You should not leave yourself vulnerable to the opposite taking place instead." Princess Azula absolutely rankled at the words, but she managed to keep her voice level. "As you say, father, perhaps too coldly level." The Fire Lord's silhouette gave a curt nod. "I do." Now, as surprisingly, a messenger ran into the throne room, breaching the highest protocols and any care for his life. Bujing frowned as the brave man had enough presence of mind to kneel behind the princess. Then the general noticed the scroll the messenger carried, stamped in black wax. It was a message of great import. Was Omasha making a move? "Fire Lord, an urgent message for you." The courier presented the scroll for a servant to hurriedly pick it up and bring to the monarch without tampering with the scroll. A black-sealed message, unlike a black ribbon one, meant that the contents were for the Fire Lord's eyes only, and having the seal broken or tampered in the slightest risked death for everyone responsible in handling the message. Heavy silence fell on the throne room as the shadow of the Fire Lord played on the fire curtain, projecting him unfurling the scroll to slowly read its contents. When it stretched on beyond a couple of seconds, Bujing knew it had nothing to do with Omashu. The Fire Lord was clearly rereading the scroll to be sure of its contents. The courtiers were beginning to shuffle with unease when the Fire Lord finally rose up, throwing the scroll off to one side for Bujing to catch. "It seems that our faith in the newly appointed Prince Xing has been misplaced." Puzzled murmurs rose throughout the hall, and even the prince and princess betrayed their confusion. Bujing read the message, and then read it again to be sure that his eyes were not fooling him. "High General Bujing, kindly read to us what has been reported." Despite the attempt at putting on a grave air, there was unmistakable delight in his voice. The general managed to nod despite his shock. "Why, yes, your highness. The message reads as follows. Prince Xing and Prince Iroh has betrayed the Fire Nation. The first has welcomed the Avatar into his palace. The second is training the Fire Nation's greatest enemy, as witnessed by Baozha." "What?" Prince Zuko exclaimed first, with his sister following just a fraction of a second behind him. Only then did the rest of the court erupt into confusion and consternation. "Father, who is Baozha?" the prince asked even as the princess rose up to her feet with indignation. "Who dares accuse Xing and our uncle of such madness?" It was a valid question, admittedly. Bujing turned to the Fire Lord, and the rest of the royal court quickly quieted down to do the same. That young Xing was being decried was one thing, but to have venerable Prince Iroh lumped together? It made the accusation actually inconceivable, and far harder for even the most greed-blinded nobles to accept. The monarch behind the curtain of fire did not help matters with how his satisfaction exuded from his voice. It is a most far-fetched accusation, perhaps, but be assured that Baojia is a most loyal servant of the throne, and his words are not to be doubted lightly. But who is the sender that he should be so trusted? Princess AZULA demanded fiercely. A man who has the full confidence of the Fire Lord, was her father's reply, cold and hard with warning. Prince Zuko stepped out to stand beside his sister, to even her surprise, and bowed formally. Father, Xing has won many great victories for the Fire Nation, and has never once wavered in his service. Our uncle, your brother, is also not one to lightly throw away the bonds of family. Surely one man's words against the two of them cannot be simply believed. There was a short pause as the Fire Lord processed the question and gave a slow nod. That is true. Bujing could taste the disappointment in his voice. This was perhaps the best weapon to use to topple Xing. That is true. But why would the Fire Lord be so happy of his own brother being accused of high treason? But the Scorpion has aptly lived up to his name. High General Bujing, High General Wulong, War Minister Gongzun. Bujing joined his colleagues in presenting themselves before the flame-obscured throne and saluting sharply. Your will, Fire Lord. Assemble a suitable force to investigate this matter. Ba Sing Se is a massive city, so take what can be spared from the armies in the colonies. Let none hinder or mislead you from uncovering the truth. Bring both princes back for formal questioning. Bujing gulped as he bowed to acknowledge the order. The second half of that was sensible enough, but to draw on the northern, eastern, and southern armies? The Fire Lord was practically ordering an invasion. No, with what an investigation to seek out evidence, from an oversized army at that, it would be more of a sacking. Of course, Princess AZULA was having none of it. Sending an army will give everyone the wrong message, and soldiers are not fit for a magistrate's work. Father, perhaps, the Fire Lord answered lightly, his mind no doubt already made up. But such an accusation cannot be taken lightly. His attention returned to the generals and minister. If they resist, it will be a sign of their guilt. You then have my permission to enact the punishment for betraying the Fire Nation. The princess all but snapped at that, standing straight to glare through the flames. You are really expecting Xing to turncoat? Of Uncle Iroh to rebel? Father, please reconsider, Prince Zuko added, more formally than his sister but no less desperate nor earnest. Their father audibly scoffed. Perhaps it is your youth that has made you so naive. Nevertheless, my orders have been given. Prince Xing and Prince Iroh will answer for the accusation levied against them. That is nonsense, the princess defiantly declared. There is not justice in this. You are already working on the assumption that they are guilty. The hall froze as she all but called out her father. The Fire Lord clearly stewed in his mind for a moment before managing to weave a curt response. Am I? A second's pause, and then the next words made Bujing almost stumble in surprise. Or perhaps you are defending them so vehemently because you're part of that conspiracy, AZULA? The curtain of fire rose higher as the Fire Lord's wrath was unchained. Perhaps the treachery that my advisors have been warning me about has been inaccurate. After all, none have considered my own brother to betray me. Eyes went wide with shock as the royal court took in the Fire Lord's brazen accusation. Perhaps then, it is not so much that my daughter is in danger of being influenced by the insidious Scorpion, but that he has already envenomed her, and has turned her against me. Father he snapped to his son. And perhaps my son has been similarly affected as well. After all that I've done for him. You've done nothing for him, the princess exclaimed with an accusatory finger. You left Zuko to rot for years just because he dared stand up against you and your imbecilic plans. Guards, escort my daughter away, the Fire Lord ordered over his daughter's ranting. Secure her you happily exiled your own son with the flimsiest of excuses, so that we may question her thoroughly later. And you'll happily disgrace and imprison your own daughter, who's worked in your name for years, for daring to call out your ostrich horseshit. Enough. Surprisingly, the princess did not back down as all the braziers in the room flared up along with the flame before the throne. No, if all it takes is one faceless nobody to damn my fiancé and my uncle, then it'll take less to clear their names. Guards Fire Lord Ozai, I challenge you to an Agni Kai, on behalf of the honor of Prince Iroh and Prince Xing. Once more a stillness smothered in the throne room, though it now carried a far tenser, far deadlier undercurrent. Bujing knew then that a clarity fell on the nobles and generals, an understanding that things might have just escalated to a tipping point. And then, no, and it all tipped over, and the general knew they were descending into madness. "Coward," she hissed. "You are merely unworthy of my time. Guards, take my daughter away. She is either corrupted or hysterical." With everyone witnessing in shock, the princess shrugged off the palace guards, trying to gently calm her down. "Why is she still here?" the Fire Lord demanded, and the guards reluctantly used more force. The princess fought them off expertly, sending most of them sprawling on the floor or stumbling into the stunned courtiers. To Bujing's horror, Fire Lord Ozai decided to escalate things further. "AZULA, if you continue resisting, I will take it as a sign of your guilt." Prince Zuko tried to reach out to his sister. "AZULA, please." His sister shrugged his hand away, standing boldly among the groaning palace guards as she stared at her father's silhouette. "No, Zuzu. I've had quite enough of our father. He holds my hostage to keep you in line. He forces me back here and undoes all I've done because he's insecure about what I've achieved in the colonies." This time, the flames both in and outside of the throne room roared loudly as the Fire Lord's wrath was fully evoked from the accusations. He actually stepped through the flames to meet his daughter's unyielding glare. "AZULA," he declared through a snarl, "your status as heir and princess are hereby revoked. As a suspect of a conspiracy against the Fire Nation, you will be held in the dungeons to share the fate of the other traitors to the throne." "Father, no. AZULA, please stop this dash. Is that meant to cow me?" Father and daughter exchanged hateful gazes, and the flames in the room grew brighter from the clash of wills. "Guards," the Fire Lord spoke with dangerous softness. "Seize this treasonous girl for defying the crown, and detain any who are associated with her to ascertain their guilt." This time, the guards came with blades drawn and flames ready. Prince Zuko was pulled aside by a guard, for all the protesting he managed, while the courtiers hurried out of the throne room. High General Bujing watched with those that dared remain as the madness continued to unfold. The princess seemed ready to defend herself again, but a hand on her shoulders caused her stance to slacken. The look of betrayal on her face was obvious as her own bodyguards surrounded her. "Princess," one of them said softly, "please." And then he surprised her by pushing her behind him, and all 6 men formed a protective wall between her and everyone else. "Run." And then they charged into their fellows, and the throne room was lit up by a blinding display of flames. By the time the 6 men were put down, the princess was gone, as was most of her entourage. For all the surprising preparation from the Fire Lord's personal house guard, they were unable to stop Princess AZULA from escaping on a ship. A declaration was immediately sent out throughout the Fire Nation home islands and colonies. The former crown princess has rebelled. Ba Sing Se too, and all those in it have rebelled with her. The allegiance of the colonies she had once administered were now deemed suspect and would be determined. Crown Prince Zuko was now heir to the throne and would be kept in safety of the palace for his own well-being. High General Bujing could only hate himself privately for his shameful cowardice for doing nothing but meekly accepting the Fire Lord's new orders. Orders to head out along with loyal commanders and loyal men to ascertain and ensure the loyalties of the armies in the field. Orders to prepare the Fire Nation for a civil war. Tai Li watched over her sleeping friend with concern. The series of consecutive bad news and the return to the palace had badly strained AZULA's patience, to a point where the princess all but snapped. She had not been present in the throne room, but seeing her friend fleeing with a small gaggle of courtiers, filled with the blacks and reds of anger and fear, told her enough. That AZULA's bodyguards, up until then discreetly omnipresent, were missing, added to the urgency. AZULA seemed at the edge of her wits when Tai Li caught up with her, with eyes filled equally with rage, disbelief, and sorrow. Yet, she stubbornly fended off the darkness gnawing at the edges of her aura. By sheer spite she remained alert and in control, if only just so. Tai Li. Good. You're here. Her voice cracked, relief tainted by a touch of wariness. I'm here to help, AZULA, Tai Li immediately replied, to assuage her and stop the cracks from spreading. One of the courtiers, a neatly groomed man who was as disheveled as the rest of them, hurriedly interrupted the reunion. We must go. The princess is being hunted. Despite how her aura quailed at the mention of being hunted, AZULA stubbornly shook her head. I'm not abandoning my people. The people in the dungeons dash. We'll get them out, Your Highness. A woman spoke out, earning nods of support from some men beside her. Your first priority is to secure an escape, Princess AZULA. But Sue dash, I'll get them out, Ty Lee volunteered, earning a grateful look from her friend. The palace wing will be heavily guarded, AZULA warned. I'll get them out, the acrobat repeated more firmly. Sneaking in had been easy, as was finding AZULA's remaining followers. There was some confusion among the guards at what was happening at the throne room, but otherwise they seemed oblivious. Lady Sue and her clique of loyal staff had been surprised at Ty Lee's appearance in the princess study room, but they quickly fell into cold professionalism when she told them of AZULA fleeing the palace. The hatching phoenix flees the swamp, the old woman declared with a hard gaze, and the men and women stiffened with sudden resolve. Then, worryingly, they began to disperse. Ty Lee didn't know exactly what was happening, but she could make an educated guess. AZULA wants all of you to follow her. The much older woman gave a resigned sigh. It does her credit to think about us, but there is much of her work here that cannot fall into wrong hands. The smell of smoke began to waft as a young man firebended a hidden drawer and its contents into ash. Outside, the guards could be yelling something at someone. Sue fixed Ty Lee with another hard look, this time heavy with sorrow. Tell the princess that we will do what we can to keep her secrets. And tell Nope, no way. You're coming back with me. Ty Lee vehemently denied, making the other robed men and women pause to stare at her for a moment. The girl drew in a calming breath, and then exhaled audibly before she stared back at Sue. I'll buy you all the time you need, and then you're coming with me. AZULA does not need more tragedy in her life. Someone spoke up, but there's more documents in the offices on the other end of the hall. Ty Lee recalled her royal friend's aloof confidence and grinned thinly. Then we'll just have to burn down this whole wing to save us the time. In hindsight, she could have thought up a better plan, but haste won over prudence. So Ty Lee had shot out to charge the first palace guards in sight and draw them away from Sue's group. Or at least that was the intention. She ended up leaving a trail of twitching, paralyzed bodies as she made her way to the palace wing's main entry, aided surprisingly by several guards who had not only recognized her, but also asserted their true loyalties to their princess. If Ty Lee had to guess, these were guards that AZULA had secured positions for as an easy means to earn some merit for their disgraced families. With their help, Ty Lee fought back the growing tide of armored men, slowly ground as more enemies poured in from other entrances. Avoiding bolts of fire and dancing between the firebenders was too easy for her. Unlike the more hardened fighters in the colonies, these firebending elite instinctively held back when she darted between them, too afraid of accidentally hitting their own. Paralyzing them instead of killing them turned her targets into convenient obstacles against their comrades. Her allies weren't having it as easy as she was, though. For all their unhesitating bravery, the followers of AZULA began to fall. Ty Lee could not help all of them, and she was forced to helplessly watch as one by one the valiant men were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Most carried AZULA's name on their lips before the flames consumed them. In the end, they were whittled from almost 24 down to just 4 men by the time one of Sue's people called out. A glance back showed that the grand hallway was already getting hazy with smoke, partly from the burning mess caused by the fighting. The rest of it was from the fires belching out of study rooms and offices. It then was a matter of disengaging from the whole mob to get everyone to safety. Easy. Ty Lee panted lightly, but gritted her teeth and was prepared to fight her way through. But the flames had weakened a main column which conveniently caved in on the mob. Escaping after that was easy enough. Really, with the thick smoke all but opaque. Ty Lee led the group of ministry liaisons and surviving fighters out through AZULA's room, the last place to be consumed by the flames. They held their breaths as best they could, and Ty Lee kept watch on the rapidly heating rooftop as some of the men carried an indignant Sue out the window. Fortunately, the palace guards had yet to make the whole circuit around the palace's perimeter to get in the way, allowing the escapees an easy escape afterwards. More flames rose from other parts of the palace complex, as well as some buildings around the capital. If she remembered her landmarks correctly, it looked like the breakout of AZULA's detained staff was successful. But that did not explain the other fires throughout the city, like the administrative district. The hatching phoenix flees the swamp, Lady Sue intoned, noticing Ty Lee's confusion. Sent out the signal as we were burning the documents. Princess AZULA put me in charge of overseeing the security of information in the palace and the colonial ministry. Part of that involves preparing contingencies. The woman stared out at the columns of smoke staining the evening skies as they continued to shuffle through alleyways. We had this planned with the expectation that the more ambitious noble houses would dare to defy the Fire Lord's patience and band together to seize power for themselves. Deny them as much useful information as we could of the colonies, the princess supporters, and hidden assets. It was what we thought was the worst-case scenario. In preparation for Xing taking boss Sing Se, she let out a heavy sigh. Never thought we'd be using it because of the Fire Lord turning on her. Su Wei then gave Tai Li a smirk filled with reluctant gratitude. Never thought I'd survive its execution, either. You're welcome, the girl answered with a bright smile that pushed back some of the oppressive grays weighing on everyone. With the fires inevitably spreading confusion in the city, it soon became easy to slip into the streets among the sea of worried citizens and blend in with the chaos. Sporadic roars of flame sent waves of fear in the populace, like the ripples of a dirty rainbow on a puddle of oil. Tai Li held back her disgust at the ugly colors playing out and tainting her vision. They reached the ship with only the panicking city slowing them down, meeting a clearly worried AZULA under the shadow of a light cruiser. Some smoking corpses littered the area, almost all members of the city guard. "About time you made it," she said without meaning the words. AZULA went to greet Lady Su Wei first, both of them sharing sharp whispers before the older woman finished with a conceding nod and walked up the ship. Then Tai Li became the focus of her friend's attention, and the girl was treated for the first time to panic showing in her usually calm and collected friend. "You're bleeding. Wadash. Oh, that. It's not mine." Tai Li gave as bright a smile she could muster to reassure the fraying princess. With no one else to wait for, they all boarded the ship and made for Zilong. It was only in the privacy of their quarters did AZULA finally allow herself to break down. "I disowned my father. I gave up my family. I'm a monster." It broke Tai Li's heart to see her usually strong and confident friend, the princess who'd made a huge change over the years, shudder with heaving sobs and tear into the bedding with her manicured nails. Without prompting, Tai Li reached for and embraced AZULA, hoping that her own faith in her sobbing friend would help push away the blackness seeping into the other girl's aura. You did the right thing, AZULA. You're not a monster. Don't worry, you're not alone. You're loved." It felt so wrong to have AZULA crying into her shoulders like a child, but Tai Li ignored the surrealness of the scene and did what she could to calm her down. Eventually, AZULA fell asleep, and Tai Li kept by her bed, cooing soft tunes to ease her into her rest. AZULA had changed so much and had saved her life. This was the least Tai Li could do as a friend. AZULA would recover the next day, as if nothing had happened, but her eyes betrayed a deep gratitude for Tai Li. It was more than enough for the girl to know that she was appreciated so earnestly. Their journey across the ocean was without incident, and in hindsight, it was to be expected. News couldn't have spread beyond the capital city so quickly, which meant that they passed by clueless patrols without slowing down. That did not mean that the ship slowed, though. Its captain had erred on the side of urgency, hoping to make it to the colonies with enough time for AZULA to either establish herself or flee. His hopes were dashed when lookouts spotted a flotilla racing up from behind them. They were small and incredibly fast things, churning out a far angrier trail of smoke than usual. Against their worst expectations, the speeding boats zipped past the cruiser, and Tai Li had to look over the rails to get a glimpse of at least 6 firebenders at the stern of each boat, heating up a boiler with a horizontal chimney that spat a furious tongue of fire. "The new ship propulsion systems," one of the former officials muttered in awe. "I thought the War Ministry were still figuring out the new loud boiler engines, but it seems that there's enough working prototypes to serve as message boats," AZULA finished with a scowl. "We might find Zilong and the rest of the colonies hostile to us by the time we arrive." As such, plans were quickly drawn. Detours were suggested, but quickly discarded due to the unknown dangers of docking in Earth Kingdom or Water Tribe territory. Simply parking the ship and sneaking through a quieter coast was also deemed too risky, as it left AZULA no easy withdrawal if they ran into trouble. They were still debating over the best course of action when the lookouts brought curious news. Land was sighted, and it was leaking smoke. As they drew closer, it became apparent that Zilong was not in any shape to receive AZULA with any hostility. Even from a distance, Tai Li could see buildings burning and small figures spurting flame at each other. Well, looks like all is not lost, Princess, Sue commented with a smirk. So I see. The sounds of fiery violence began to reach Tai Li's ears, and it took a while before she could pick out the war cries. For the Fire Lord, kill these treasonous scum. For the princess, down with the Fire Lord. It was heartening to hear more of the latter than the former filling the air, and it gladdened Tai Li to find that disparity in support was filling AZULA with her old, confident reds and yellows again. Just for added effect, Tai Li grinned at her friend. You hear that, AZULA? You've got supporters fighting for you. An invisible burden lifted off the princess as she stood straighter and nodded with renewed resolve. Indeed, but it'd be a shame if I lost any more of them to the paltry scum serving my father. Everyone ignored the brief stumble in her words, and even Tai Li felt the buzzing expectation making her stand straighter as AZULA turned to address them with all the authority of a defiant and unbowed crown princess. I'll be going down there to show them how to conduct a proper fight. If any of you are following, don't you dare shame me by dying to those sniveling cowards. It was possible that the whole ship shuddered from the cheers as AZULA took off with a burst of blue fire. The other firebenders followed after her, many leaping instead of rocketing through the air, carrying her name on their lips as they landed on the beach and immediately began charging into the fray. Tai Li and the other non-benders restrained their eagerness right until the ship crashed deep into the docks, conveniently breaking a tight formation of palace soldiers in the process. Some didn't wait for the boarding ramp to drop before they were jumping off the ship's sides. Tai Li was one of them, finding a convenient landing pad in the form of a couple of soldiers harassing a group of earthbenders. The fighting that followed was not as chaotic as the one in Ba Sing Se, but the carnage was far, far worse. Pretty much the entirety of the colony was up in arms against the forces from the home islands. The division rather helpfully marked out from the former, being in more worn and simple attire and armor, compared to the latter's shiny and more ornamented look. Firebender and Earthbender colonists worked together to corral and then brutally crush the Fire Lord loyalists without a second thought, while their outnumbered enemies struggled to form a proper defense. Even the one-armed Overseer Day was thick in the fighting, covered in soot and wielding a broadsword to literally single-handedly lop off limbs and heads. His nephew, the former Governor Han, fought with him, his spear work rather reminiscent of the 11th's own style. When she had the time to think about it, the colony's guards were pretty much a less refined mirror of the 11th Regiment. They charged right up to firebenders with spears and swords and clubs, forcing their opponents to abort their movements and move out of the way. They also worked in packs, picking apart their foes by isolating them before working through the more heavily armed soldiers at their leisure. The daring attacks cost several of the colonists their lives, but they seemed more than willing to pay it as they continued beating back the Fire Lord's troops. And then AZULA made her appearance by engulfing a quartet of palace firebenders in her blue flames. Their dying screams were quickly drowned out as the colonists' fury was further stoked. Princess AZULA. Fight for Princess AZULA. AZULA gave a theatrical sigh. Fools, don't just fight for me. Fight for yourselves. Fight for your homes. Fight for Zilong. For Zilong. For the princess. That more or less sealed the end for the remaining supporters of the Fire Lord. Tai Li idly elbowed a pitiful official armed with a decorative blade. The thing was sharpened, but clearly unbalanced and too blinged up in the back of his neck before she paused to appreciate the mood. The whole town was radiating an outraged red, swirling with relieved and joyous blues and yellows. It was a far more intense experience than watching Tonto the knife thrower catch his signature, not-so-broad, sword via sword swallowing in his final act. And it was far more stirring as well, obviously. Tai Li caught a glimpse of a small mob dragging Governor Seo and his lackeys out into the streets. And then her view was obscured by more colonists swarming the doomed official. There was a lot of earth bending and fire bending before they dispersed. Tai Li couldn't see any signs of the governor or his people after that. Overseer Day ignored the pleas of a former colleague and ran the man through with his sword in a swift motion. Just a few paces away, his nephew was hacking away at more robed officials, screaming back the derogatory insults that were probably once tossed at him. The mood was rather intoxicating, really, and Tai Li let herself bask in it for now. She can deal with the horrors of such bloody violence later. Maybe ask if AZULA can help hold her hair back once the realization really hit her. The slaughter was over in a matter of minutes, marked by AZULA's triumphant flames blasting into the sky. Day was the first to drop to his knees before her. "Princess, we thought the worst when those mewling idiots dared declare you a mere criminal to be hunted down and returned to the palace, dead or alive." Han offered up a formal salute as the bloodied men and women of Zilong too knelt before their princess. "Princess AZULA, Zilong does not forget its true ruler. What would you have of us?" For a few precious seconds, Ty Lee spied a spike of uncharacteristic cyan in AZULA's aura. She was genuinely touched by the colony's loyalty. It took a second before AZULA formed a reply. My father will be sending his armies to claim the colonies. We can fight, but that would be a futile thing. Zilong and the other colonies were built to keep earthbenders from entering from land. We are all easy prey for a naval invasion." Her blunt words threatened the giddiness of the colonists, but the grin that followed kept their hopes up. "So we will not fight. Not yet. Colonial. No, Administrator Day, Administrator Han, organize the people for an evacuation, and prepare the messenger hawks. We will make for the safety of Ba Sing Se." Lady Su-wei walked up beside the princess with a snarky grin. "And spirits save anyone who dares get in our way once word reaches the Scorpion." Suki was enjoying a short stopover in a village, maybe about halfway to Ba Sing Se, when a rider charged in, pausing only to give out a quick declaration before urging his tired ostrich horse back onto the main road. News from the royal capital. By decree of the benevolent Fire Lord Ozai, the former Princess AZULA is now fully disowned and hereby charged with treason and treachery most foul. The armies of the Fire Nation have been mustered to apprehend her and her conspirators, including the treacherous and ungrateful Prince Iroh and Prince Xing. Any and all who give her and her followers aid will be deemed complicit and dealt with appropriately. The village initially broke into worried murmurs, and Suki joined in the group activity of discerning whether the message was a hoax. Sure, she saw things go a little sour, but surely AZULA wouldn't be that reckless to draw her father's wrath? If that was the case, what in the world was her father thinking to denounce his daughter so publicly? Regardless, AZULA was clearly in danger now, but the herald's message did hint at a few silver linings. The princess was still at large, and she had an entourage with her. And perhaps just as importantly, the Fire Nation will still require some time to trample across the colonies to crush any potential support for AZULA. All that meant that Suki now had to decide on whether to hurry back to Ba Sing Se to relay the news, or head to the colonies to search for AZULA. Suki considered the princess as enough of a friend to warrant that. The decision was made for her the following morning, just as she was leaving the Simple Inn. This time, it was a Fire Nation transport tank rolling through the village at a road-churning speed, billowing smoke from behind it as its tracks seemed to wobble. The war machine seemed to have been pushed hard, and so was its crew, judging from how a couple of exhausted soldiers all but fell out of it. Curiously, while their armor was that of a standard Fire Nation colonial patrol, the men each wore a band of orange cloth on their left arm. Despite their weariness, the soldiers' voices were strong and clear. "People of the colonies, Fire Lord Ozai has turned against his daughter, Princess AZULA. Together with his court, he conspired to not only remove her as colonial minister, but also revert the changes the princess had wrought on the colonies. The Fire Lord had intended to return the policy of discrimination against earthbenders and Earth Kingdom migrants, as well as replace colonial-born officials with those from the home islands. For the crime of questioning such policy changes, the Fire Lord has disowned Princess AZULA and sought to detain her." The murmurs this time carried far more worry. The first speaker seemed genuinely angry as he spoke, and his comrade continued as he stopped to catch his breath and massage his throat. Furthermore, the Fire Lord, for reasons unknown, has denounced Prince Iroh and Prince Xing, his brother and his soon-to-be son-in-law, as rebels conspiring against his throne. The two princes who have served the Fire Nation loyally have been marked as traitors due to baseless accusations. The second speaker paused to take in a breath, and by then the crowd was leaning in with anticipation for the coming words. Princess AZULA is now calling for all the people of the colonies, locals or migrants, to seek shelter before the flames of war spreads through the territories. For the sake of your lives and that of your families, stock up on what you can and seek refuge away from the main roads. You are not required to join her cause, only to survive. To those from the Earth Kingdom, please do what you can to hide your origins, so that you do not fall prey to the forces of the Fire Lord. Both men drew up to attention and then bowed. On behalf of Princess AZULA, we extend our deepest apologies for the coming chaos and wish for your continued safety. Suki rushed out to the men, just as they were going back to their tank. Wait a moment. Do you know where Princess AZULA is? Does Prince Xing know? The men shared glances before shrugging as one. The princess is leading the people of Zilong to Ba Sing Se. Prince Xing should be notified soon by Messenger Hawk. Well, that made Suki's course of action a lot clearer. She watched as the tank drove off with a violent lurch, a blast of black smoke tainting the space where it used to be. Still, for how much it looked like the metal vehicle was about to fall apart, it still shot off much faster than the ostrich horse from yesterday. After that, Suki quickly packed her belongings and headed down the road where the messengers had come from. Xing would have plenty of time to work with Ba Sing Se, but AZULA might need some help. OSH-. Sokka was forced to quickly convert his downward slash into a desperate block as his instructor casually shifted her wooden knife to threaten him. Just like every bout before this, it was a futile gesture as within seconds the training knife was pressed against his neck. His training instructor helped him up with a patronizing grin. Nice try, fainting with the war cry. But seriously, drop the shouting when you're swinging. You're not at the level yet to worry about mind games. Yeah, thanks. As he got up, Sokka glanced at his wooden sword, a blade at least 3 times longer than Captain Ren's dagger, and felt the doubt creeping back into him. Despite all the traditional advantages of reach and the training from Master Piandao, the Run had consistently bested him with just a dagger. And it was clear she wasn't being serious about it, either. On the bright side, the captain and her colleagues had said that Sokka was still more than a decent swordsman. He just didn't have the first-hand experience to refine what he'd learnt from Master Piandao. On the other hand, this whole exercise made Sokka clearly aware of the difference between a duel and a battle. His first lesson with Run had her introducing an important principle of the 11th's style of combat. Do whatever you can to survive. She has brought him down in mere seconds by slipping past Sokka's guard and then lightly snapping her shin up between his legs. The wooden knife met his neck as he crumpled to his knees. On their second fight, Ren spat at him just as he parried her first attack, and the surprise was more than enough to have her dagger resting right underneath his chin. You have a sister. You would do anything to protect her, right? Which is more important, what she thinks about you, or that she's alive at all. You are fighting for her. You are fighting for your family. Your life, your reputation, your everything is secondary to that on the battlefield. Do what must be done so that they live, ideally with you coming out of it intact, so that you may keep protecting them. It was basically a wordy way for Run to say that she encouraged Sokka to fight dirty. She grinned approvingly when he had experimented by throwing the training ground's dirt at her. Unfortunately, it was too slow and telegraphed, and it resulted in Sokka kissing the tip of the dagger. But at least Rin was a nice sport about it, and didn't give Sokka too much of a hard time. Everyone was the same, in fact. Just like Xing, the captain and her folks were nice enough people to be around with, ignoring the fact that they had a much higher tolerance for appalling acts of violence anyway. They gave no airs of superiority as Sokka learned from them. And even Katara had to admit that the tips she received from the soldiers were not only useful, but very politely given. Aang too looked far less tense during Iroha's absence. From what Sokka could see, the firebending instructors were taking their jobs just as seriously as Aang was learning from them. Toph, needless to say, was getting on amiably with the Fire Nation folks in the palace, probably because of the refreshing change of having the hardened warriors all regarding her with wary respect. Oh well, Yama says he's got nothing to teach her, someone had said with admiration. That practically means the old badger mole's admitting he's worse than a blind girl. The old fart still refuses to acknowledge his loss to Xing. So yeah, that's definitely something. If not for the tension hanging in the air, Sokka imagined that the gang would have settled in rather swimmingly with the overlords of Ba Sing Se, just like the North Pole. A shame for the political differences and the failed assassination attempt, really. After Xing caught the three-eyed assassin, Sokka and his friends were barred from entering a section of the palace for their own good. It wasn't a total euphemism, as apparently Toph went pale when she tried sneaking a look through her vibration senses. That she was adamant about not speaking of what she saw further encouraged the gang to abide by the new house rules. Until it was lifted days later, coincidentally with the announcement that the explosion-bending assassin had finally revealed his employer. But why? Aang asked, completely stupefied. Iroh is his own brother. Xing was frowning, but he still managed to give a casual shrug. The Fire Lord might have somehow seen Prince Iroh as a threat, and with his more understandable wariness of me, it was a convenient enough plan. Remove a threat by assassination, and then frame that on the other threat. I still find it hard to believe that Ozai has resorted to this, Iroh sighed. Sokka was surprised that the old prince showed no sign of outrage, only deep, disheartened disappointment. Perhaps I should not have taken my brother at face value. It could not be helped, Xing replied earnestly. Your time with him was limited in these past few years. None of us were around to witness whatever had changed him. Toph was not alone in frowning at that last sentence. Sokka liked to believe that he'd gotten to know the scorpion enough to tell he was hiding something. Still, if Toph didn't remark on that, neither would he. Azula needs to know, Iroh said with another sigh. The younger prince nodded. I guess it's about the best time to see who she trusts more. You're awfully casual about this, you know, Katara commented, unable to help herself. Sokka didn't know what his sister found offensive in Xing, but she made it a point to keep needling him, to which Xing generally countered with a wall of politeness. In this case, he just offered her a faint smile. I'd be lying if I said I was completely surprised by this, seeing as to how the Fire Lord has treated his own children. I just thought he'd have come up with a more justifiable plan. Xing then turned to Iroh. No offense, Prince Iroh, but my impression of your royal brother as a shit schemer covered up by competent secondaries has yet to change. First knowingly promoting Zhao to show up Zuko, and then this? None taken, Iroh answered with only some unease. Anyway, Avatar Aang, we'll have to find a way to hasten your training. Then we can talk about lessons in politics. Probably with King Bumi, since he's been in power the longest. And Xing. The giant Lieutenant Colonel Kai burst in the meeting room with a message scrunched up in his hand. Princess AZULA. That immediately got the Scorpion to rush over and receive the scroll as Kai verbally relayed the news. AZULA had been disowned and denounced by the Fire Lord, who was now fleeing Zilong with pretty much its entire population. Xing and Iroh similarly declared treasonous criminals for conspiring with her and the Avatar to usurp the Fire Nation. Zuko was not really heir yet, but definitely kept in the palace as a prisoner of sorts, and the Fire Nation was redeploying its armies to reconquer the colonies. Sokka couldn't help it. Iroh? Like Xing said, no offense, but your brother's shit. Well, look on the bright side, Xing somehow managed to say with a thin smile. And what's that? Aang asked. Now we don't have to pussyfoot around the whole matter of making peace with the Fire Nation. We don't. Xing gave a grave nod, and then drew up straighter to address the room. Someone get this down on paper. In light of these idiotic actions from the Fire Nation, from the assassination attempt on Prince Iroh, and the uncalled-for insult of Princess AZULA, I, Prince Xing of Ba Sing Se, hereby declare my full support of my fiancée Princess AZULA. Ba Sing Se is now officially in rebellion against the lack-witted, ungrateful Fire Lord and father, that is Ozai. The prince's head lowered a bit, and his voice dropped to a dangerous monotone. For the sake of the innocents caught up in this madness, I will strive to find a swift conclusion to this civil war. If it means working with the Avatar, or personally swimming to the home islands to slit Ozai's throat, I will see it done. Sokka was reminded of how glad he was that the gang wasn't at odds with the Scorpion anymore. Kai led the majority of the 11th Regiment out to meet and reinforce their princess. Deciding on what to do had been a contentious issue, especially with how undermanned Ba Sing Se was. In the end, Xing relented to having Wei Kong's battalion remain in the city while the rest of the regiment went forth. Spirits or not, the boy had too much faith in the Earth Kingdom generals. The spate of surprise attacks had shown Kai and the other officers that the spirits either did not consider everything in handing out their advice, or they simply didn't care because it made for good entertainment. Especially now, with news of the Fire Lord's idiocy, Xing's position would no doubt become precarious, as the dumb shits in the city might think their chance had come again to remove him. Xing would have to be especially careful, as Prince Iroh and the Avatar had left to treat with King Bumi of Omashu and its coalition of Southern Earth kingdoms. But of course, Xing being Xing, he was taking things a bit too casually, and seemed eager to make himself bait. If not for Run giving a solid smack at the back of his head, their little brother might have gone through with the ridiculous plan of making another public speech to draw out more opportunistic assassins. Common sense was asserted, but only just. Kai sighed at the other barely acceptable ideas Xing managed to convince everyone to adopt, like getting Yama to train the collaborating Earth Kingdom armies, and including Run and Kylan as part of a diplomatic mission to go with the Avatar's friend Sokka to the Northern Water Tribe. At the same time, the Avatar's other friends, the blind earthbender Toph Beifong and the Water Tribe girl Katara, were persuaded to work with the Mechanist in optimizing Ba Sing Se's agrarian zone for a potential siege. Whatever optimizing meant, Kai had been there for the eccentric man's presentation, but he still couldn't grasp how rezoning the farmlands and arranging canals and roads could be as significant as Xing seemed to think it was. Well, maybe that's why Xing was prince and Kai wasn't. The recently promoted lieutenant colonel returned his attention back to the present, glimpsing out of his transport tank to take in the surroundings passing him by. The plains and forests beyond Ba Sing Se's walls were tranquil, almost pristine save for bits of human artifice like huts and roads. Everything was so serene. It was easy to fool oneself into thinking that there wasn't a war looming. Civil war. Kai scowled at that thought. To think that the ungrateful bastard of a Fire Lord had enough of a rotten brain to set an assassin on his own brother, just to drag Xing down. The bastard and his court of similar-minded scum were the reason the Fire Nations stuck in war for so long, parasitizing off the suffering as they callously sent clueless men and women to their deaths. In contrast, Xing had turned the 11th's fate around by defying traditional Fire Nation doctrine, bloodied the Earth Kingdom in such a way that the raiding on colonies had petered out, and taken the supposedly impenetrable Ba Sing Se. Okay, that last one was likely unachievable to anyone else, but still, he did all that, trying to save Fire Nation lives while pushing for a victorious end to the war. And his reward was the envy and treacherous resentment of the dimwits back in the home islands. Wastes of their mothers suffering in birthing them. All of them. The biggest shame out of all of this would be that the 11th might have to face fellow soldiers whose only crime was following their orders. Their commanders might be complicit in sipping the shit like the royal court, but the rank and file would be paying the price of it. Hopefully Xing would come up with a way around that. Sneaking into camps to slit throats can only go so far. The convoy of tanks eventually met up with Princess AZULA's own train of refugees. To Kai's relief, they all seemed in good enough spirits, despite the bloodstains on many of them. Zilong's guards were with them, serving as dutiful escorts. Princess AZULA led the whole group, riding alongside the blood-caked figures of Governor Han and Overseer Day. Her friends were with her too. Tai Li and Suki rode just behind her. Princess, it is good to see you well and unharmed. Your 11th Lancers are at your service. Kai and the captains followed Mosey's lead in kneeling in full deference before their princess. Thank you, all of you. The princess kept a regal mask on, but there was something a bit off about her, Kai noticed. And then a coldness in his guts bloomed when the lieutenant colonel realized that the princess traveled alone. Her bodyguards were absent. Mosey also noted that fact, as he was the one who voiced out the dreaded question. Your safe return was not too arduous, Your Highness? And there it was, a momentary crack in her expression, a flash of pain and guilt that quivered on her lips and flared in her eyes. Not too arduous, though the cost has been high. The princess paused for a moment, no doubt recalling the day of her escape. Good men died for me, she muttered, causing her friend Tai Li to ride up and rest a comforting hand on her arm. And more good men will die because of me. Nonsense, princess. One-Armed Day exclaimed loudly. You are not to blame for this mess. If not for you, many more lives would have been wasted by the feckless idiots in the palace. Kai found himself nodding in absolute agreement. He wanted to say something in support, but Ping had to beat him to it. Her voice just as loud as day, so that the unsubtle audience behind the princess could hear the words clearly. You need not bear such a burden, AZULA. All who fight for you know what the stakes truly are. You stand for all that's good in the colonies, and that's more than enough of a cause for us. Better we die because we have to, defending the good you have fostered and built, than to die to incompetence from the half-wits from the palace who have never so much as set foot on this continent, nor are acquainted with the life here. Shit, that was way better than what he wanted to say. Abandoning Zilong is a small inconvenience, Your Highness, Governor Han added with a reassuring smile. After all, we've heard that there's plenty enough space in Ba Sing Se. Better to move there, so that your highness need not get torn between your generous attention to us and Prince Xing. Ah shit. And the man had to take up the teasing quota. And it got some good-natured chuckles from everyone too. Kai gave up on trying to chip in, and focused on keeping his grumbling nonverbal instead. Thank you. All of you. Now come. The faster we get to Boss Sing Se, the better. Mosey snapped up a crisp salute. By your will, princess. He then rose, and the 11th rose up with him. All right, captains, see to your battalions. Sungo, I want your scouts ranging out. As orders were given, Kai absently picked at what he could have contributed to raise the princess' spirits. It'd be bad if it was all Run and Fan that left her with a good impression. The colonies were all in an uproar when the royal decree reached their ears. Zilong had immediately risen up in rebellion, massacring the Fire Lord's newly appointed administration before the whole colony just up and fled to Ba Sing Se. And that was days before the Fire Lord's armies began setting their boots on the ruins of the now abandoned colony. The colonists had torn up the docks and the shoreline with earthbending, rendering landing operations slow and hazardous. Silos and warehouses were devoid of even a single grain of rice or a speck of flour. Not even the bedding was left in the houses. So complete was their evacuation. It was a sight that gnawed at the morale of the line troopers, and High General Bujing could do little to counter it. Not yet. He'll let the other commanders and promoted nobles try their hand at it, and worry about actually figuring out how to win this. This was just Zilong. News was coming in from the other colonies, and many were in the similar vein. Practically all of the bigger, more prosperous port towns had thrown their lot with AZULA the moment she was denounced as a traitor. Only in one case did anyone from the royal envoys survive the colonists' indignation at the insult to what they saw as their true ruler, and that was only because she played dead. On the bright side, there were mixed results from other smaller colonies. A small number were cowed into compliance, though many of its population, especially the Earth Kingdom natives, fled within a few days. Only 4 colonial out of 40 proclaimed their loyalty to the Fire Lord. But Bujing was uncertain if they were being truthful about it. Princess AZULA had picked up some nasty tricks from the Scorpion and implemented them in political warfare, after all. Unsurprisingly, most of the Earth Kingdom vassals in the northern and eastern territories had all declared independence from the Fire Nation once the news reached them. The few that remained aligned to the Fire Nation only did so because of the heavy presence of advisors and peacekeepers. The courtiers traveling with the army were confident that it'd be an easy thing to reconquer, or even just bribe the recalcitrant states back into being vassals. But Bujing would be happy to just have them stay where they were until this whole internal mess was done with. Sieging Ba Sing Se would no doubt be a nightmare, so alternatives would have to be found to get the princess and the Scorpion to at least attend some negotiations. With so many colonies emptying out to seek Ba Sing Se, there was the option of catching up with a few refugee groups and taking them as hostages. It'd leave a sour taste, but if they could filter out Fire Nation colonists from Earth Kingdom natives, maybe public sentiment wouldn't be too damaged. Maybe if they got lucky, they'd bag 1 or 2 of AZULA's important secondaries who might be leading the refugees. The information they might provide could help secure an entry into Ba Sing Se. It was a slim chance, but right now, Bujing took a slim chance as way better odds than none at all. Besides, he had to operate on the assumption that the continental armies might not be on his side. General Shou's ties to Xing was well known, but General Wa's steadfast and unmovable resolve was also a known thing. Whether the couple would tear at each other or come to an agreement was anyone's guess, so the High General planned around them. There were many more factors to consider, many headaches that plagued the feasibility of taming the continent. Bujing did not like the chances of pulling off a victory over this civil war and then winning over the Earth Kingdom. King Bumi and King K would no doubt be chomping at their bits to take advantage of the Fire Nation's fracture, though perhaps some accommodation could be made with the latter at least. It'd depend on whether Fire Lord Ozai would agree to acceding all claims on Ba Sing Se, but it'd buy the loyalists a measure of peace from some portion of the Earth Kingdom. There were too many problems, too many considerations, and not enough time or resources. Bujing began to remember why he quickly sought the safety of serving as advisor in the palace. And then a hawk flew in from the east, bearing the Scorpion's seal. It not only announced the Fire Lord's hidden source Baozha as an assassin against Prince Iroh, but also was the young prince's official declaration of secession and war. as if Bujing didn't have enough problems already. He'd have to speak with his commanders to figure out an effective way to stop morale from plummeting and hesitancy from spreading. Was Sokka glad to see you again? Definitely. But did he wish the reunion could be done in better circumstances? Most definitely. So yeah, this is my Grand Aunt Kylan and Captain Rin of the 11th Regiment. 11th Royal Regiment, the captain corrected lightly. Yeah, what I said. Chief Arnuk nodded gravely at Sokka's companions, particularly frowning at the Fire Nation people with Run. Xing purposely had her come with only female soldiers. Sokka was sure of it. I will not lie by saying that you are all warmly welcome to Agna Kele, but after what we owe the Scorpion, and on behalf of my future son-in-law, your presence will be tolerated. Come, a meeting hall will be made ready for us to hear what you have to say. Sokka was about to follow after them, but Rin of all people stopped him. He did not like the glint of mischief in her eyes. Let us adults do some adult talking first, then we'll call you. She glanced to Chief Arnuk, who nodded in some sort of understanding, and then returned her attention back to Sokka with a grin. Maybe go catch up with your fiancé? Seeing you blush a bit made Sokka blush even more. But he managed to nod and watch the Ba Sing Se delegation head off with the leadership of the Northern Water Tribe, leaving him alone with you. Well, discounting some guards, but if he could get used to the ones in Ba Sing Se, he'd survive these. So, you. How's things been? She answered by leaping at him with a warm embrace, and a kiss that just about melted Sokka into a puddle of joy and warmth. I've missed you, you simply said, her bright blue eyes staring deeply into his. Somehow, he managed to form the words to reply despite being lost in her eyes. Yeah, you too. It was a reply, just not a good one. You led him down into the palace, which Sokka frankly didn't notice much as he enjoyed alternating between staring at her face and at their joined hands. Yu's skin was warm, her eyes were bright, her voice was warm, her smile was bright. She was warm and bright, and Sokka zoned out everything else just to bask in her presence. After a while, she noticed that he wasn't listening to her, and they settled for a comfortable silence together. Again, maybe there were guards around, maybe there weren't. Sokka didn't care. He wasn't going to be a perv. You smelled very nice as she rested her head on his shoulder. You'll have to go back after this? Those words Sokka registered, as well as the sadness in them. Yeah, he answered reluctantly. I'd like to stay here, but you have a job to do, you finished, her words devoid of accusation or resentment. You're the Avatar's companion, and you have to help him save the world. Just resignation, which made Sokka feel even worse. I'll try to be back again soon. For good. I promise. Her melancholic smile made him almost seriously consider the idea of talking to Aang. Almost. It's all right. Take all the time you need, Sokka. I'll be here. Just promise me you'll be back safely, all right? I promise. Sokka immediately answered without hesitating. They enjoyed each other's presence and warmth for a bit more before one of Chief Arnuk's advisors came up to escort Sokka to the meeting. You followed along, her hand still in his. Sokka drew strength from her as he faced the Northern Water Tribe's leadership, meeting Chief Arnuk's gaze with all the will he could muster. The man was mildly annoyed, likely at the smug-looking women sitting at the opposite side of the table. Grand Aunt Kylan especially seemed to be preening. Sokka, Captain Ren here tells me that you have important information to share. Information about the Fire Nation. The boy gulped before he nodded once. The chief's presence was very intimidating when he got serious. Boy, was Sokka glad he didn't have to face that back when his engagement to you was announced. Yeah. So back in the Siwang Desert, we found one Shirtong's library. And in it, we found mention of the Day of Black Sun. I still say this is a bad idea, AZULA, Ping recited again. Tai Li held back the urge to chime in as well. AZULA had been adamant about this the moment the 11th's scouts brought word of a small force coming down from the north to potentially occupy a major road blocking any movement to Ba Sing Se. Small enough that the officers of the 11th had made the mistake to say aloud that they could take them on. The princess had then insisted on meeting said force to either welcome them to their ranks or destroy them utterly for being a nuisance. Personally, Tai Li saw the fierceness in her aura and kept her peace as the others foolishly tried to persuade her otherwise. After whatever happened back in the throne room, AZULA was now a miniature caged sun, just waiting to vent at appropriate targets. And so with Captain Ruffin's battalion escorting the Zilong refugees back, the 11th, almost now at half strength, marched on to meet AZULA's potential victims. From what Tai Li heard from the scout reports, the approaching force turned out to be the entirety of a Fire Nation garrison. Probably got ousted from an Earth Kingdom city, Colonel Mosey mused. That's a lot for a garrison force. They outnumber us by a bit, Captain Ping muttered. Some states needed the incentive to be cooperative, AZULA responded with a nonchalant shrug. Or we could be looking at a paranoid and cowardly overseer. I didn't make all the appointments for those postings. They ended up meeting the fleeing group on a wide stretch of grasslands, the tall grass flowing in pretty waves from lazy breezes. AZULA had Colonel Mosey and Captain Ping with her, with Tai Li, Suki, and some guards joining in to complete the delegation. One of the soldiers carried the flag of parley, and they walked up for a bit before AZULA had them all stop and wait. What if they're hostile? Suki asked with only the barest hint of concern, armored in green as a Kyoshi warrior but lacking the face paint. Then they'd be setting a very bad precedent for any of the home island loyalists, Colonel Mosey muttered coldly. Fortunately, their opposite number also marched out under their own white flag, and both groups began to move to meet in the middle. As they got closer, Tai Li picked out the nervous auras wafting from the other group, which spiked further as they themselves got closer to recognize AZULA. Princess AZULA, the governor. At least Tai Li assumed the most opulently dressed of them was a governor, sputtered in greeting. But the woman did not bow in deference, nor did any of her entourage. Not the best signs, Tai Li thought, and judging from how everyone at the 11th tensed up, she wasn't alone. Governor, what brings you here? We were forced to flee from Zufang after certain news reached the city. AZULA's voice became a little tighter. News of your treachery. One of the governor's aides spat, an older man with graying hairs and beard. The fiery defiance in his aura was not shared in the slightest by his colleagues, which was interesting. They positively shrank away from him. Please, Princess, we just wish to return home to the islands, the governor pleaded, bowing this time. We want no part in this dispute. Angry orange spikes shot out from the princess. Do you speak for just this group of yours? Or are you including the soldiers following after you? The old man made himself known again, this time daring to point a finger directly at AZULA. You will not drag in any loyal sons of the Fire Nation into dash, silenced Saburo. The governor tried to cut in, but the damage had been dealt. AZULA let out a sigh, half regretful, half eager. I see. While I commend you for your loyalty, however misguided, I cannot allow you and your men to pass through as is. Leave your weapons here, and I will let you pass unharmed. You may keep your armor, your ostrich horses, and your lives otherwise. This time a trio of the governor's aides went to subdue the older loudmouth and drag him back to allow her to plead her case further. That would leave us vulnerable. These lands are dangerous, These lands are only dangerous to the unarmed and the unwary, the princess interrupted. You have a couple of thousand men under you. Armed or not, there are sure to be firebenders with you. Claiming that you'll be defenseless sounds most disingenuous, Governor. But either lay down your arms and leave in peace, or hold on to them and face me in my 11th. Decide now, Governor, or I'll decide for you. It was quite impressive how AZULA's imperious aura swallowed up the opposing delegation, cowing even the old firebrand with just her steely voice and hard glare. Out of politeness, Tai Li ignored the sharp tang of a loosened bladder from at least one of the administrators. Unsurprisingly, but to the princess' mild displeasure, the garrison force marched through with their spears and shields littering the field behind them. As the soldiers of the 11th harvested the weapons, AZULA stared at the backs of the disappearing force. Since we're here, we might as well see if there's any more refugees to protect. Are you sure, Princess? Colonel Mosey asked. You should be returning to Ba Sing Se with all due haste. Prince Xing is keen on meeting with you again. There was a flare of pink emotions, but AZULA quickly stamped down hard on it to maintain her facade of steeliness. Xing will need to wait. I cannot have the loyal colonists fall prey to the approaching home island armies. She then fixed Mosey with a muted glare. Would that be a problem, Mosey? The man let out a sigh and shook his head, but surprisingly he was smirking. And it wasn't just him, but the other officers as well. No, Princess. Xing was expecting such a response, in fact. It's why we have extra provisions, as well as extra messenger hawks to update Ba Sing Se of our movements. And nobody was stupid enough to make that bet, Ping commented drily. Mosey then saluted, which was quickly followed by every other soldier around him. "The 11th is yours to command, Princess AZULA. As you wish, we shall begin refugee security operations." Ty Lee smiled as she saw how the warm blues and reds bloomed in AZULA's aura as she drew strength from the devotion of her regiment. The shows of loyalty over the past few days have been good at countering the lingering foulness from the royal palace. There were still people and things that the princess could still hold dear and rely upon. Still, there was a disturbing undercurrent of worry in her. It was taking Ty Lee days already trying to figure out the cause. But as the 11th were making camp for the night, she spied her friend sneaking off for some solitude in her tent. Ty Lee dared not make a sound as she saw AZULA's shoulders rise and fall in slow, steady breaths. But then the movements became erratic as the princess broke into soft sobs that leaked ugly black tendrils into her aura. Ty Lee had to swoop in before AZULA crumpled to the ground as she broke down. "AZULA, AZULA, what's wrong?" Her royal friend looked at her with teary, pain-filled eyes, all signs of restraint gone. The darkness of fear and despair consumed her once vibrant aura. What if he's right?" she bawled. "What if who's right?" Ty Lee asked in a soothing tone as she held on to AZULA. "My father," the princess croaked hatefully. "What if she dash nonsense?" Ty Lee cut in immediately. "Don't say that. Don't think that, AZULA. By all accounts, your father's completely in the wrong. He tried to kill Xing and your uncle, remember? Whatever he thinks of Xing, it's only because he's jealous and petty and frankly stupid." The darkness around AZULA barely rippled. The princess' sobs receded as she drew in a shaky breath. But Ty Lee couldn't help a touch of sternness in her voice. "You said it yourself, you chose Xing. You had him figure up the best ways to serve the Fire Nation. Xing might be smart, but you're too smart to be led around blindly, AZULA." The words caused a ripple, but AZULA's aura remained oppressive. There was a moment of silence before her friend looked at her with almost childlike eyes under the tears. Does that make me the problem then? Oh spirits, AZULA's repressed insecurities were flooding in with a vengeance. How much of it did she have? Ty Lee bit back a sigh as she held the princess by the shoulders and looked her dead in the eyes. "AZULA, AZULA, look at me. All you did was be a better princess than your father could be as Fire Lord. Okay, you took in Xing and made the best use of him and his people. You made the colonies prosper. You cared for them when everyone else did not. It's no surprise that they are now on your side when your father decides to throw a silly tantrum." Ty Lee made sure to fix a hard stare at AZULA. Nowhere near as scary as the princess effortlessly pulled off, but it did the job in grabbing her attention and calming down her tumultuous aura. The inky blackness didn't go away though. "You fought back because your father was being very stupid. You did the right thing, AZULA. But what?" she asked with some exasperation, and a half-serious whisper crept into the back of her mind on whether this was a fair price for getting a more human AZULA. Would Xing care? Ty Lee couldn't help the stunned silence as she blinked at her friend. The heart of AZULA's black dread was revealed. Would Xing see a dash? She almost wanted to let go of the princess to raise her hands and roll her eyes. "AZULA, Xing sent out the 11th to get you. He expected you to be looking out for the refugees, and equipped the 11th for that. I think that's more than enough sign that he cares for you, and doesn't give a flying turtle duck about whatever anyone might say. But I'm no longer crown princess." Ty Lee dearly wished right now that AZULA had gone straight to Boss Sing Se instead, so that she could offload all this straight to Xing's face for him to deal with. She was running thin on the right responses to banish the darkness clinging to the princess. "You're still a princess, AZULA. Last I heard, you're engaged to the Prince of Boss Sing Se, right? Would it still be the same? Maybe she could get someone from the 11th to fly and get Xing over. Or just fly AZULA over to him. Yes, AZULA. It'd still be the same. Because I bet you that Xing doesn't care whether you're heir to the Fire Nation or not. He loves you because you're you, not because of the royal headdress you're wearing." AZULA's sensibilities seemed to be recovering after that delivery, and the glum blacks and grays grew fainter. Not enough for Ty Lee's liking, though, and she felt annoyance gnawing at her. She hated that it was taking this long, that her friend was stuck in such an ugly and gloomy state. There should be a sliver of soothing amber reminiscing of happier times, a flicker of warm, calming green at understanding the irrefutable fact that she was still loved. Anything that AZULA could grasp for comfort amidst the smothering irrational fears that plagued her. Ty Lee hated to see her friend in such a rut. And if he doesn't, That makes him a shallow, petty idiot no better than your father. And you know what? If Xing decides to be that idiot, then I'll take you instead. The words came out stronger than she'd like, but Ty Lee felt satisfaction in seeing the faint wisps of embarrassed pink flicking out of AZULA. What? Ty Lee stared straight into AZULA's eyes, feeling her friend tense up in her arms. More shades of pink flitted out of the princess. Good. Better embarrassment and confusion than the icky, oppressive fears. I mean, you're pretty smart and pretty. She absently noted her voice being a little husky, and her friend's features becoming more detailed. Princess or not, that's a great dash, hey. A familiar voice snapped her out of it. So fixated was she on the gratifying break of AZULA's dreary mood. So focused was she on banishing away the darkness once and for all. Ty Lee didn't even care to wonder why her stunned friend's upper face took up the entirety of her vision. Only after blinking away her own confusion did Ty Lee realize just how close she'd brought her face down towards AZULA. It was close enough for her to feel the princess' warm breath washing against her mouth and chin. It was close enough that with a simple jostle, their lips would be brushing against each other. But AZULA was a bright swirl of embarrassment and uncertainty now, which was a much better change. Hey, get off her. Suki called out again, and this time Ty Lee's awareness returned fully. As she reared back, she turned her head to find the Kyoshi warrior walking over, a fountain of concern and outrage. Ty Lee slowly let go of AZULA, and the princess quickly squirmed away and got up to her feet. Surprisingly, Suki went straight for her, deep worry in her soft voice as she placed a comforting hand on AZULA. Are you okay, AZULA? Yes, I'm fine. It was just... Suki looked over the princess to be sure, and then turned to Ty Lee with a surprising spike of anger. What were you doing? She hissed. AZULA was crying, and I wanted. The words rolled clumsily off her mouth, and Ty Lee found herself unable to form the right response. The right excuse to blunt the harsh spike. I experienced a moment of weakness, AZULA interrupted, her voice stiff and still fraying a little. Ty Lee was comforting me. Most of the dark emotions were banished or buried away, too, which was nice, if not for the small licks of confused and angry reds at the edges of her embarrassed pink. By kissing you? Suki finished in an angry whisper, earning no reaction from the other two girls. Do you know how much trouble you'd be in? Ping sent me to check on you, because they were hearing noises. I just dashed. Ty Lee froze before the full sentence formed. She just wanted to do away with the ugly black aura surrounding her friend, and drawing out the stunned embarrassment had been achieving that. But it wasn't the right approach to take, was it? Ty Lee then felt AZULA's hand fall on her shoulder. She didn't mean for it to happen, I'm sure. She turned to find the princess wearing an awkward but grateful smile, her anger barely visible as a dim halo. Thank you, Ty Lee. A strange flavor of shame and regret suddenly welled up. Yeah, no problem. And sorry about that. AZULA forced on a reassuring mask as she took Ty Lee in for an embrace. It's all right, Ty Lee. I know you meant well. AZULA meant it, too, which somehow made Ty Lee feel worse. Then the princess turned to Suki, offering a single, heavy nod. Though, thank you for intervening, Suki. I'm just glad you're all right, came the side reply. Puzzlingly, the wisps of pink were still there as AZULA quickly rebuilt her old facade of royal confidence. Come, we'll talk about this after some rest. Clearly we all need it. Ty Lee nodded dumbly at that and followed AZULA out, almost completely ignoring Suki's sharp look as she began to ponder over her misstep. Hey, everything okay? Ty Lee turned to give Suki a short nod. Yeah, guilt stabbed in her belly as Suki's expression took on the dark yellows of concern. Had her response been incorrect? Or was it just that there wasn't any good ones? Suki had replaced her anger with genuine concern after leaving the tent that night. She gave away AZULA's emotional weakness, but said nothing about Ty Lee's near mistake. After that, and AZULA reassuring the worried soldiers that she was fine, the three girls went to get some sleep. Despite the mood, all three shared the same tent, because that was their sleeping arrangement up until now. An invisible barrier, almost tangible with awkwardness, kept Ty Lee from rolling too close to AZULA, who she was sure remained awake throughout most of the night. And then the next morning Ty Lee had the rare experience of being fussed over by her friends for once. So, are you really feeling better now? AZULA asked, the softness of her tone completely at odds with her usual demeanor. There wasn't any trace of anger in her. Ty Lee managed to nod at that. Yeah, Sorry again, 4-hush. I was being stubbornly irrational. You were strained to your limits handling me. How was AZULA being so calm about this? The wry smirk she gave was even genuine in its speckling of good-natured humor. I suppose it's better than having Suki walk in on you slapping some sense into me. That got Suki to chuckle, though it dripped with an awkward purple. It'd be harder to explain to your 11th why your cheeks have handprints on them, she conceded, the delivery nowhere close to AZULA's dryness. Suki was a poor joker, Ty Lee absently thought. You're not mad. AZULA placed a comforting hand on Ty Lee's shoulder, exuding soothing blues and calming amber. The point is, neither of us were acting like ourselves yesterday. I got stressed, and it stressed you out as well. The older AZULA would have made a sharp, snarky comment to get Ty Lee back on her feet. Maybe throw in a few threats to go with the insults. This AZULA was using a far gentler touch, the same gentleness that made her surprisingly good with kids. Ty Lee was too impressed to feel any pang of shame at being so patronized. What's important is that it didn't get that far. And it'll never go that far again. I understand, Ty Lee said with a grave nod. AZULA gave her shoulder a slight squeeze. Nothing threatening, just a friendly, reaffirming one. You're a good friend, Ty Lee. The closest friend I have now. I know you were trying to cheer me up. That's why you were almost being ridiculous. Ty Lee found herself smiling, and judging from how warm her friend's aura became, it must have been a good, bright one. Ridiculous is putting it mildly, Suki added with mild heat in her words. Where AZULA was using a soft touch, she on the other hand played the role of disapproving older sister very well, mostly frowning and occasionally scowling at Ty Lee with just the right amount of disappointment. If your idea of calming someone is by kissing them, you really need some help. Ty Lee didn't mean to, AZULA repeated lightly. Yeah, but she still almost did. Ty Lee endured the alternating between reassurance and chastisement up until breakfast, taking in the words but spending most of the time looking inwards. Why did she try kissing AZULA? Looking back, it was an utterly ridiculous thing to do. Her aura had been pink enough. She should have pulled back and let the confusion do its job. But she didn't, because she'd wanted the ugly despair to be banished immediately. Thinking more on it, Ty Lee realized she was annoyed that her friend was floundering in that rut for that long, and that her usual array of cheeriness and soothing words were ineffective. She was annoyed that she wasn't able to turn the deep, inky dread into the colors she wanted, the colors she usually got out of her friends. So much so that she barreled straight down the path that worked. It surprised Ty Lee to find how selfish her intentions had been. She was not doing it because of AZULA, because of her friend, but because of her own need to feel. To feel what? Capable? Useful? That question nagged Ty Lee for the rest of the day, and the days after that. The 11th managed to come across and shepherd 4 refugee trains, leaving the colonies in just a week of ranging with no further incident. Kai was honestly relieved that no further trouble was encountered during the whole thing. Even if some of the others, the lieutenants that were recruited from ostracized families in particular, were keen to prove their worth. Going back to Ba Sing Se was something that was a bit overdue, in the lieutenant colonel's opinion. Even with the Fire Nation armies needing time to deploy, the city-state was too vast and required time for its defenses to be prepared. Fire Nation armies. What did that make the Xing and the 11th? What did that make the princess? Were they still Fire Nation or something else? Kai didn't like the term rebels much. He'll leave it for the prince and princess to decide. They're the brilliant young leaders after all. They'll think of something. Speaking of which, Kai also noted a peculiarity in the princess. The brittle confidence that she forced upon herself was still there, but the lieutenant colonel noticed moments of awkwardness in her, especially as she hung about with her friends. And come to think of it, the girl Ty Lee also seemed skittish. Before, she was bouncing with annoyingly bubbly energy, but recently there's a nervousness in her. Suki, the Kyoshi warrior, also became more stern. Her change was the most noticeable, probably because she was the least trained in obfuscating like Fire Nation nobility. She seemed to hover between Princess AZULA and Ty Lee. If Kai had to guess, the girls got into a fight of sorts. The light kind, that needed reassuring. Ping had her suspicions, but the captain didn't elaborate any further. It was annoying, but it was a good enough sign for Kai. That meant it wasn't anything too serious that'd jeopardize Xing or the 11th. He'll probably have to figure out a way to, literally, tease out the details from Run once they got back, because the two captains are bound to share shit like this among themselves. In the meantime, all Kai could do was keep watch and settle into his promotion. Being second in command was interesting, but it was more tedious than Mosey made it out to be. It amounted to what felt like chores to keep the regiment running, constantly ticking off lists in Kai's head to ensure that nothing was left out and the wheels of the 11th ran smoothly. He now also had to serve as Mosey's sounding board in just about everything. And Mosey was far from the mischievous Shing of the past who grinned as he kept his inside jokes or proposed ridiculous ideas. Mosey was usually utterly straight-laced, unless he was being swamped by Earth Kingdom women anyways. Sure, he gave faint smiles and smirks when Kai tried cracking jokes, but unless the matter's really important or someone stepped on the wrong toes, Shing, the princess, and the regiment being three of them, the colonel was content to be as minimalistic with his emotions as possible. Those qualities made for a solid and reliable friend off duty. But boy, did that also make Mosey a boring superior to work with. Or was Kai just spoiled being a captain dealing with Shing's madness all this while? They encountered their final group of refugees on the way back to Ba-Sing-Se. Interestingly, they were all mounted on either ostrich horses, Komodo rhinos, or the wagons that the beasts pulled. And animals and wagons alike bore the ubiquitous green emblem of the Cabbage Trading Company. In fact, its owner, the man Kai once knew as Jay Choi, the humble cabbage merchant, was taking up the rear on his own ostrich horse. The refugees cheered at the sight of Princess AZULA, while many of the 11th broke into grins at the sight of an old friend. "Hail, Princess AZULA!" The cabbage merchant was about to lead the crowd in kneeling as old courtesies demanded, but the princess waved it off. "No, we can skip the formalities. The day is still young, and all of us, need to get to safety." Princess AZULA then fixed her attention on the Jai Choi. "I see that my investment in you has paid off." The food magnate bowed deeply. "I have prospered much thanks to your highness' rule and gift. It would be most rude to not repay some of the debt when I am able to. I have sent orders to my branches and warehouses throughout the colonies. The provisions owned by my company will either find its way to Ba-Sing-Se, or it will be destroyed to deny the invaders." Kai and the other officers nodded at the man's impressive show of support. Jai Choi has opted to fully throw his lot in with AZULA, even though he was technically Earth Kingdom. Kai doubted that most Fire Nation traders right now would have any qualms serving both sides if they could. Even the princess was mightily impressed by his dedication. "Once we make it past this ugly chapter, I'll make sure Shing finds something for you in Ba-Sing-Se, if you're interested in it. A position or exclusive trading rights, at the very least. Your Highness is, as usual, most gracious. By allocating the bountiful transports for the old, the young, and the infirm, the massive group made faster time towards safety. Spirits were high among soldiers and refugees alike. Kai got to sample the cabbage merchant's latest iteration of pickled cabbages, spiced and boiled into a damned hearty soup with Komodo rhino tail and various forms of sweet nuts. The juicy, taste-loaded crunchiness of the veg, as he bit into it, was almost sublime. The princess and her friends might not understand the sheer brilliance of the cabbage merchant, but for Kai and his colleagues, even Mosey, after spending years mostly living off foraged and donated foodstuff, the 11th acquired a more refined palate for the simple and ubiquitous cabbage, especially with how it easily ascended beyond just a crunchy green when cooked with the right ingredients. Even when it would otherwise be down to roots and bark, Jai Choi appeared with his cabbages to save the regiment. If there were a cabbage spirit out there, the 11th would be venerating it fervently at this point. They savored the fantastical new dishes from Jai Choi right up until Ba-Sing-Se's walls came into view. Already, with just a week's time, some obvious changes had been enacted. The breaches Shing made to the wall remained, and though it was still undergoing tidying up to serve as main gates, jagged triangular pieces of wall now jutted out, looming over the openings like fangs of a maw that were waiting to be dropped onto the entrances. Up on the walls itself, Kai had to squint to make out the dots that he later realized were Fire Nation-styled trebuchets, and as they got closer to the city, slits now lined the wall at regular intervals, somewhere about halfway up the massive walls. Once they reached the breach-turned gates itself, Kai had to let out an impressive whistle as he saw earthbenders slowly scooping out trenches and molding spiky barriers. A stream of common laborers carted in sheets of metal, for purposes that escaped Kai at the moment. Shing was taking the security of the city seriously, even if any force somehow took the walls. The 3 breaches were the only way to secure a supply line into the city without wasting precious time. According to Yama, even earthbenders would need time in lowering sections of the wall. Time that had to be spent fully concentrating on earthbending and could be easily interrupted by simple things like fire bolts and arrows. So the holes in the walls were now points of utmost importance in accessing Ba Sing Se, and rather than block them up, Xing was making them unignorable points to be fought over. Pity the Fire Nation or Earth Kingdom fools that were forced to play with whatever toys he had cooked up. Ba Sing Se's collaborating soldiers welcomed them in, their once green and yellow uniforms now brightened up with red pauldrons and helmets. With the threat of an approaching invasion, the formerly defanged soldiers were fully kitted out again, some sporting male undershirts that gave additional protection to their usually exposed armpits. Work didn't stop when Princess AZULA arrived at the entrance, though many paused just for a moment to catch a glimpse of her. A couple of squads from 1st Battalion formed themselves up around her and her friends as a security detail. This time, orders were to not hold back in case of any surprise attacks. A welcoming party of administrators came out to greet them, kneeling. "Princess, welcome back to Ba Sing Se. We are all glad for your safe return. Prince Xing is busy with several matters at the moment, but he promises to meet you at the palace gates." Kai wasn't the only officer frowning when he caught the flicker of a wince from not just the princess, but both her friends as well. Was it something that happened during her escape from the royal palace? Did someone actually dare? Mosey sent a subtle glance at Ping, who gave the barest of nods in acknowledgement. They needed more information. If someone hurt the 11th's royal patron or her friends, heads will be slowly grilled before they roll. AZULA found it easy to smile as Xing stood before her, flashing a playful smirk as he bowed. "Welcome back, my princess." His princess. Yes, that sounded about right. "It's good to be back, Xing," AZULA replied brightly, ensuring her voice was clear enough to carry to the audience around them. The considerations of their station was something she couldn't forget, especially now. "I'm glad that I can still rely on you, after the foolishness from my father." She saw Xing almost roll his eyes. "The Fire Lord tries to kill his own brother to frame me, along with his other questionable decrees. Especially in denouncing you, there is only one path to take." The blatantly obvious tone he took lifted a huge weight off the princess' mind. Ty Lee had been right. He cared, far more than she could fathom. AZULA blamed her shitty upbringing for not noticing that. "That doesn't make me any less grateful, my prince." She forced back the worst of her blushing as she said the words, though it was pleasantly surprising how easily she could say them in public. He was her prince, she was his princess. Xing's smirk turned into a bright grin. "Welcome home, Princess AZULA." As the brief welcoming ceremony was done, walked up beside Xing and led the rest of the procession back into the palace. And obviously now anyway, there wasn't even a drop of disapproval from him. Exiled or not, Xing unconditionally saw her as his equal. Stupid, dysfunctional royal family dynamics, almost making her miss such an obvious thing. As they climbed the great stairs of the palace, AZULA tapped her Xing on the arm. "I'd like a moment of your time, Xing." A discreet moment. Her prince gave her a curious and concerned look. "Everything all right, AZULA?" he asked softly. AZULA kept herself calm with some effort, a spike of her old fear rising up. "It should be, I think," she honestly answered. She felt Xing tense up and heard his voice turn cold, and the protectiveness in turn warmed her heart. "Does it require certain operations?" "No, Xing." He gave her a subtle, searching look, remaining carefree as he gave an acquiescing nod. "As you wish, my princess." The relief on his face was gratifying. Her Xing really treasured her. He wasn't the puppet master her father accused him of, or the cold, calculative pragmatist that her fear had screamed out that night. AZULA almost sighed with giddy happiness at that. But that was improper, so instead, she held onto Xing's arm a little tighter, humming contentedly at his querying look. They left the others to end up in one of the deeper hallways and wound up in a quiet study room. The bodyguards waited outside, giving the couple a moment of true privacy. "This room is secure, my princess," Xing said as the door was locked behind him. "Did someone hurt you? Do I have to prepare an execution team?" AZULA shook her head as she walked up to him and draped her arms around his neck. No, she muttered into his neck, breathing in his scent. I just missed you, Xing." The princess realized just how much she truly meant the words as they shared a minute of comfortable silence in each other's arms. His warmth mingling with hers, his heartbeat pounding lightly against her chest, his strong arms giving her a sense of unparalleled security as they held her close. AZULA finally let out a sigh and forced herself to get it over with. "Xing, yes, my princess?" he playfully replied as they parted from their embrace with reluctant slowness. She willed herself to look him in the eye. I have something to tell you," and AZULA forced herself to disgorge everything to him. Her pathetic breakdown, Ty Lee stopping her from falling, the girl's gentle touch and words, the kiss that almost happened, Suki's timely intervention, how it happened, how it felt, everything. To her intense relief, Xing simply listened intently, showing only concern as she explained her surrender to despair. "I should have been there for you," was the first thing he softly said, his arms still holding on to her. "I'm sorry that I never made it clear how I feel about you. I shouldn't have given you any room to doubt." AZULA rolled her eyes as her Xing decided to be melodramatic about it. "No, it's my fault for not reading the signs, you dummy. I mean we." She looked away with embarrassment as she remembered their intimate moments together. "You know what I mean." "That I do," Xing answered with a nod. Then he had the audacity to bring a hand to her cheek and slowly turn her to face him again. What sort of cheesy plays has he been watching? "But still, I'm sorry I couldn't be there." AZULA redirected the conversation before they both devolved into a warm, fuzzy mess. "That's all right. But you're not angry at Ty Lee?" He finally frowned, though it wasn't a strong one. "You said she was doing it to cheer you up?" "I had time to think about it, and well, teasing was always her weapon of choice," AZULA explained, remembering the roiling in her mind on that sleepless night. There was a temptation to give in to outrage, but instead she ended up rationalizing it, picking apart her childhood friend's behavior and moods right back to when they met. Connecting the dots was easier than figuring out the overlapping intentions of a political maneuver. Ty Lee had been easy to like, tolerant of insults, and almost never stepped on anyone's toes. Almost, but because her cheeriness, once thought by AZULA as a vapid one, occasionally annoyed those she interacted with. She knew the right words to say to keep her out of the worst trouble, making it easy to mistake her attitude as sycophantic if not for how casually she could offer valid critiques, however uncommon that was, from a safe distance, so to speak. Just like courtiers and their propensity to use particular schemes, Ty Lee's methods became clear once AZULA put some thought into deciphering them. Teasing and unrelenting optimism. Just like how she ribs my about Zuko, or AZULA about Xing she didn't say. It might be a bit more extreme of her, but I'm sure she didn't mean anything beyond trying to get me out of my wallowing. She hoped. It might perhaps be the most optimistic AZULA has ever been about something. Xing nodded without a trace of doubt, but the princess felt like she needed to explain herself further. "I know I should have tried to reject her, but you were surprised and your thoughts were not balanced to begin with," he cut in, sounding as if he'd been in that situation before. "To say the least," AZULA reluctantly admitted with a sigh. It still sat poorly to admit entertaining such stupid insecurities. Xing gave a brief, self-deprecating chuckle. "I remember my first interaction with an officer outside those of the 11th. A well-to-do garrison captain whose care I was given to be fostered or adopted into a stable family instead of running around with the ragtag regiment. That wasn't a story AZULA had heard before, so she found herself attentively listening. He questioned me in his office, and I started to relax. Xing seemed to stare off into space, his body tensing up. Then he was looming over me. I saw how his expression twisted, saw where his hands were moving to, but I didn't move. Couldn't move. Indecisive and confused, I think. He let out a slow exhale, taking all the tension with it. Rin interrupted the whole thing. She wanted to give me a farewell present, but recklessly barged in as she does and, she needed only a second to look at how we were posed, and she immediately dragged me out of the room. The chuckle returned, and AZULA found herself disgusted at how lightly her Xing was retelling the story. The coldness in his gaze kept her from remarking on it. That man was the first Fire Nation body the first throat I slit. I'm sorry you went through that. What could she say? Xing shook his head, banishing the dark mood away as if it never existed. It's nothing. Hasn't been anything for a while. But yeah, I know how it can be. A ghost of a smirk suddenly flitted across Xing's lips, and despite the heavy mood lingering, AZULA immediately felt a sting of annoyance at seeing it. What? I guess I should be fortunate that you don't have any male childhood friends, my princess. Oh, don't start, she groaned. Then, seeing the air between them lighten, the princess decided to risk it. But Xing's head quickly tilted to one side. But AZULA tried not to appear too meek or let her gaze waver. But when Ty Lee got close, I felt. Her prince raised an eyebrow at that. Is this the part where I should be worried about being replaced? No, AZULA blurted out, and then immediately kicked herself in her mind at shouting the words like that. No, it felt strange. Strange enough that you're bringing it up with me? There was a few seconds pause before she answered honestly. Yeah. Xing's response was to hug her again, and another wave of relief flooded out of AZULA. I'm glad you trust me so, my princess. I'm sorry that I don't be. You're being honest. I prefer that than worrying over what might be gnawing at your thoughts. And on that note, the long wait was unsettling. Ty Lee fought the urge to fidget as her nerves gnawed at her conscience. Days after that fateful moment, with enough time to herself thanks to AZULA insisting on maintaining an awkward not really distance between them, the realization of what Ty Lee had almost done, with AZULA began to really settle in. Xing would find it. That went without saying. How he'd react, though, that part got Ty Lee worried, especially if he wanted her to be honest with him. Would she have stopped herself back then, if Suki hadn't arrived? Truthfully, probably not, unless AZULA had forced her off. She'd been too invested. Her need to lighten AZULA up addled her sensibilities. Could she be trusted to not do so again? Ty Lee genuinely didn't know. And that scared her, just as much as Xing possibly asking the question did. The impulsiveness, the habit to respond to the mood of others and turn the dour colors into something brighter. That was something she only now recognized as not entirely correct. And more troubling still, it took some time for Ty Lee to recognize what drove that urge. She didn't like seeing people, especially people she knew and liked, to be down. She literally hated, seeing their auras so bleak, which was why she smiled for them and laughed with them, and gave her all in comforting them without prompting, whether they needed it or not. It was the right thing to do as a friend, she once thought. Friends shouldn't let friends cry. But now she wondered if she was doing it less for them, and more for her own satisfaction, at seeing the colors play out prettily the way she liked. It almost led to a dangerous mistake. Maybe it led to smaller errors to occur as well. Could Ty Lee have changed AZULA if she had focused less on keeping the princess in the right reds and pinks and oranges, and instead deliver advice that could have brought darker tones into her aura? Could Mai be brought out of her shell of glumness if Ty Lee had really tried pulling her out of it, instead of being benign and passive, content to just tease out the emotions from her every now and then? After an eternity of stewing in her thoughts, the door opened, and Xing's head popped out. Ty Lee, please join us inside. There were no signs of angry reds around him, but the prince carried a worrying band of steely gray in his aura. Ty Lee kept herself calm as she quietly nodded and entered the office. AZULA radiated a comfortable red, which Xing almost mirrored save for a streak of grays. They both seemed calm enough, but the Prince of Ba Sing Se fixed Ty Lee with an unnervingly hard but bland stare. Ty Lee. Yes, Xing, Prince Xing? You've been accused of attempting to seduce my fiancé. Ty Lee gulped before she nodded with all seriousness. I did. It almost took her a second to remember the words. But it was a reckless action. I got carried away, and I wasn't thinking when I She snapped her mouth shut when Xing raised his hand. His aura flickered, but there were no angry colors spiking out of him. Still, Ty Lee found herself nervous. Please let AZULA be right about this. The prince squared up before her, and Ty Lee was almost tempted to take a step back before his steely gaze. You are AZULA's friend, a trusted friend, but you almost broke that trust by taking advantage of her. Ty Lee only nodded silently, grateful to notice Xing addressing her friendship with AZULA in present tense. You are her friend, he repeated, and right now my princess cannot afford to lose her friends. But here it came. Ty Lee watched how he sighed with mild annoyance. I cannot trust you to be with her alone. I understand. So, Ty Lee, I'm hereby promoting you to a training instructor. Training instructor? You'll be responsible for introducing your skills into a select number of the palace staff. Staff who could use your agility in their work. AZULA was nodding to the words, which was a sign enough for Ty Lee. Thank you. Xing gave a lopsided smirk. I am not going to break up the friendship you two have. But admittedly, with your new role, You might be spending a bit less time with AZULA. I understand, Xing. The smirk disappeared, and Xing put on his serious mask again. AZULA assures me that what you attempted was a one-time mistake. Please don't make her a liar. I won't, she replied with an earnest nod. So, the great dragon of the West, we meet at last. King Bumi grinned as he stared down at Prince Iroh, who stood beside Aang. Don't take this the wrong way, but you don't look too princely to me. The prince merely smiled, as if it was a compliment. I'm afraid my time away from courtly stages has worn away my old trappings. Bumi looked to his friend, who seemed a bit off-center. So what brings you here with him, Aang? King Bumi, the boy said in a passable formal tone, which rang the playtime bells in the king's head. I don't know if you've heard of the recent happenings in the West, but I've heard. He rose up in his seat and cackled a bit. A family squabble made the Fire Nation collapse on itself. The Fire Lord's daughter is plotting with his brother and her fiancé to turn on him. Or the Fire Lord was caught trying to take them out before they outshined him. Pretty awesome stuff. Yes. Well, I'm here to help mediate between Omashu and Ba Sing Se. So, the Scorpions really claimed the place for himself, eh? Aang glanced at Iroh, who then gave a reassuring nod for him to continue. Yeah. Through IR, Prince Iroh. Prince Xing wishes to discuss the possibility of peace between his land and yours. The kid's a year ahead of schedule, but still. Bumi put on a deep frown and stroked at his chin for a moment, making a suitably showy hum before answering. Peace between the Scorpion who deposed the Earth King, eh? Prince Iroh's hands opened palms up as a gesture to open talks. Prince Xing understands that there is bad blood between him and you, but he hopes that a compromise can be achieved. Tell me first, Avatar Aang, Prince Iroh, why should I bother treating with you? My advisors are asking me to just start marching north to reclaim the continent. The Chow Dash, because Prince Xing wishes a swift end to the conflicts. Iroh interrupted Aang with a surprisingly steely expression and voice. Not just for the one he will face with the Fire Lord, but with this century-long war. And he wishes for a resolution that caters to the new, regrettable balance of the world. Bumi almost grinned as he noticed how much Iroh didn't like saying that last sentence. Which is why I am here seeking an audience with you, and not the former King K. Boy, did that get a reaction from Omashu's royal court. Bumi saw how frowns of suspicion slowly turned into those of wary approval. After all, while K was busy being turned into a headpiece again by his vassals up in the northeast, Omashu had been solidly leading a coalition that kept the south stable and peaceful. So, the stories about the Dai Li, Bumi said slowly and clearly, to make sure everyone heard this. Kidnapping and turning their own people into empty-headed slaves. Are they true? Aang looked a little sick as he nodded. I was there at Lake Laogai, it is true. The Dai Li operated without King K's knowledge. This time, Bumi did grin as the murmurs rose up around him. Such incompetence wouldn't earn the young exiled monarch any new fans. And as we left, the city has still not risen in revolt against Prince Xing's rule. Iroh chipped in again. Quite the opposite, despite the recent attempts on our lives. The citizens are overall more tolerant of his rule. For now, Bumi added, mostly to keep up his role, though he knew that the reputation on Ba Sing Se's old rules had been irrevocably scarred in his court's minds. It was interesting how Aang was reluctantly nodding to confirm the prince's claim. As useful as that gesture was, the old king still felt sorry for his friend being unwittingly used as a pawn in this grand and crazy scheme. Xing was right. The Avatar needed an education beyond just mastering the elements if he's going to deal with the world's many issues. Regardless, Prince Xing's mandate to rule the city is arguably stronger than the ousted King K. For the time being, at least, Bumi slowly stood up and put on a fierce scowl, one that he rarely used anymore. So you're expecting me to accept a Fire Nation Scorpion ruling over the Earth Kingdom's capital? As if they were reading off the same script. Prince Iroh bowed deeply as he spoke with slow gravitas. Please understand that for the time being at least, we require a home to survive our coming civil war. Bumi was almost exaggerating with his slow nod. If what you say is true, you've got one heck of a treacherous brother, Prince Iroh. And loath as I am to say it, at least the boy Xing has been more reliable, for how much of a scorpion he is. He threw Aang enough of a frown for a wary king, he hoped. And since you've got the Avatar speaking for you, I guess I'll allow you to continue wasting my time. Prepare a room for my friend, the Avatar. Oh, and for Prince Iroh too. Bumi made it look like he was about to dismiss his court, but then froze at the last minute for a not-so-offhand comment. Oh, by the way, do you play Paisho, Prince Iroh? Being involved in actual diplomacy made Aang realize just how out of place and depth he was. The words Bumi and Iroh spoke to each other said one thing, but the airbender couldn't help think that there was at least one other layer of meaning behind the words. The king and the prince wore polite smiles as they conversed and negotiated, but their eyes were sharp, and there were flashes of smirks and frowns exchanged every now and then. They talked over meals, over games of Paisho, and even while Bumi observed Iroh training Aang in firebending, there was a constant dialogue. To Aang, it was as if his eccentric old friend and the genial old prince he was getting to appreciate had transformed into different people. They were behaving like kings and princes. That realization was an annoying sting to Aang. It meant that Xing was right in suggesting he take lessons in politics. He was already missing out on a lot right now, and he'd been briefed by Iroh and Xing on what was being secured for Ba Sing Se. What kind of avatar would he be if he remained oblivious to the undercurrents of diplomatic exchanges? He'd be terribly vulnerable to being tricked into supporting the wrong cause. Was he being tricked into supporting the wrong cause now? No. Aang almost hated that he was confident in that answer. Xing had taken Ba Sing Se, but after what was uncovered and the changes he had in store for the city, it was undeniably for the best, at least for the near future. King K's own surly uncle, Yama, had been adamant that the city-state didn't need his nephew's return. This city don't need a useless king. My clueless nephew might have inherited the throne, but he definitely does not deserve keeping it. After all the shit that went on right under his nose. You don't care that the Fire Nation's taking over your home? Huffed. The brat might represent the Fire Nation, but trust me, Xing's anything but Fire Nation. Too smart, too competent, too dangerous. Oh, don't tell him I said all that though. He doesn't need more praise getting into his head. That sentiment was, Aang found out with some asking around, shared by the people who were once prisoners of Xing's regiment. From what he learned from Iroh, they must have been through a lot to have the soldiers and prisoners trust each other so much. So unless things change for the worse, Xing will still be in charge of Ba Sing Se, and he'd have Aang's reluctant support. After all that he's done for the city, he deserved at least a chance at proving himself. Now if only Xing could stop being so easy to dislike, or make an effort to be at least a bit more approachable as a person. Aang ran through those thoughts and more as he stood at the edges of Bumi's and Iroh's negotiations. After mostly giving up on trying to chip in, they were debating over historical borders, generational rights, and other such things that Aang understood was highly significant, but couldn't really grasp just yet. So if we are to return things to what they were, Omashu should also give up its eastern grasslands to its neighbor. As I recall, it used to belong to Nushang before they got pushed out by force. Hey now, that's a different story, is it? If I remember my lessons right, the king of Omashu at the time marched his army to claim the precious grasslands to give the city more farmlands. It's been a while longer than the colonies, but the Nushang has been asking for their old land back for a while before giving up, because Omashu simply ignored them, claiming that it had a generation at least born and raised there, and called it their home. I see that your family shares a common trait in being annoying. You flatter me, King Bumi. I'm sure you're just as acquainted with royal insight as I am. It was mildly exasperating for Aang to keep up with their topics, especially when they devolved into trading gentle insults like they were in a play. But what really threw the boy off was when Bumi and Iroh talked over Paisho. It seemed like they were making their moves on the board in time with their words, like there was some sort of code to it that Aang was not privy to. They smirked a lot too, while they played. It was weird, like there was something obvious and glaring that Aang was not getting. In the end though, the meeting did its job, and Aang felt uncomfortable as he stood between Bumi and Iroh in the former's throne room. He had to remind himself to speak loud and clear, and maybe use his airbending to carry his voice throughout the hall. I, Avatar Aang, hereby witness the agreement made between Omashu under King Bumi and Ba Sing Se under Prince Iroh, on behalf of Prince Xing. The whole formality was not as intimidating as he first thought, but Aang still did not look forward to doing more of this. Omashu recognizes Prince Xing as the current sovereign ruler of Ba Sing Se. Ba Sing Se recognizes King Bumi as not only the king of Omashu and the leader of the coalition of Southern Earth Kingdoms, but also the most suitable representative of the Earth Kingdom as a whole for the time being. Aang at least understood the implications of that last part. For some reason, Xing was championing Bumi to become the new head of the Earth Kingdom. It was understandable, after what went on in Ba Sing Se, but outright shunning King K like this felt rude. Ba Sing Se will not continue the Fire Nation's policy of expansion. Ba Sing Se also confirms that it does not hold any claims to any holdings in the Earth Kingdom, beyond the colonies that have pledged their allegiance to Princess AZULA. That contention will be discussed at a later date. Omashu will not take any action to directly or indirectly support the recapture of the Fire Nation colonies until that contention is resolved. Both states have agreed upon a non-aggression treaty and boy did that treaty cover a lot of scenarios. Both Iroh and Bumi extensively briefed Aang about what it did and did not cover. There were a number of slimy ways for states to get into non-aggressive conflict that still could see lives lost and homes burnt down, and the exchange of trade delegations. Omashu will not interfere with the developing internal Fire Nation situation, and has no obligation to aid Ba Sing Se. Aang signed his name on the thick official paper containing the entirety of the agreement, and watched both Bumi and Iroh take turns stamping their seals below his name. Only after that, and when they shook hands, did he exhale loudly with relief that his part was done with. For some annoying reason, the old men were smiling too calmly at each other. Just so we're clear, from king to prince, we're not allies, understood? Iroh nodded slowly. Of course, King Bumi. Good. Bumi then turned to his court. Righto, boys and gals. I want copies of that whole agreement. Get word out to the rest of the coalition to make sure they're updated. Now, as agreed, Omashu will be sitting back to enjoy the Fire Nation burning itself from the inside out. On an unrelated note, I am taking a much-needed but short break from the throne, and will be handing over my duties to my stewards and advisors for a bit. The grin that grew on Bumi's face sent a shiver of dread up Aang's spine. And on another unrelated note, completely unrelated, I assure you, I suddenly remember that Ba Sing Se is looking for any help to join them in fighting off the Fire Lord. Is that right, Prince Iroh? Of course, Iroh nodded, wearing a serene smile all the while. Bumi clapped his hands together a bit too eagerly. My, what a coincidence. I'm just off my throne, so now I get to volunteer in a purely personal capacity. Where do I sign up, Iroh? Oh, is it okay if I brought some friends along? I'm sure I can find a warrior or 100 who'd be interested in throwing rocks at firebenders. The bad ones from the islands, of course. Aang sighed. Maybe he can put off firebending mastery for a bit, and immediately begin his studies with Iroh and Bumi on court politics, intrigue, and disgustingly creative loopholes.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going. Plus, it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.